Good morning and welcome to the Public Service Commission. We are here continuing with the hearing in docket number 2023-9-E. This docket concerns Dominion Energy South Carolina Incorporated's 2023 Integrated Resource Plan. Let's take a roll call of commissioners. Virtually, we have Commissioner Irvin attending. Present in the hearing room, we have Commissioner Justin Williams, Vice Chair Powers, Commissioner Thomas, Commissioner Carol Lee Williams, Commissioner Caston, and Chair Belser. This morning, we have a public witness that is with us this morning to present virtual testimony. Do we have Mr. Kitch on the phone? Good morning, Mr. Kitch.
Hey.
Thank you for being with us this morning. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Mr. Bachman to give you some instructions.
Okay.
Good morning, Mr. Kitch. We're going to swear you in briefly, and then we're going to ask for some information, after which you will have 3 minutes to provide your testimony for the commission.
Okay.
Do you solemnly affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you, sir. Will you please provide the commission with your name, your street and town, but not your full residency address, and whether you are or are not a Dominion Energy South Carolina customer?
Yeah, my name is Sean Kitch. I'm in Charleston, South Carolina, Jamesy Cove Drive.
Thank you, sir. And are you a Dominion customer?
Yeah, yes, I am.
Thank you, Mr. Kitch. You'll have 3 minutes for your testimony. We ask that you remain on the line following those 3 minutes, as the commissioners or parties may have questions for you. Your testimony may begin now.
Thank you for being accommodating and letting me express my thoughts regarding Dominion's IRP. I've lived in South Carolina most of my life, mostly in the Charleston area, and living on a coastal town, particularly prone to flooding, hurricanes, and heat. I've become more and more concerned about the impacts of climate change locally, and I worry what they mean not only for myself, but my two young boys and their potential children. I'm grateful and really encouraged to finally see some climate-based initiatives taking place on a local, national, and global level. 10 to 20 years ago, I think there was mostly talk at best. And I'm certainly not an energy expert by any means. And I recognize that there's a lot of inherent challenges in making a rapid transition towards clean and renewable energy. But that being said, I do worry there's been a fair amount of greenwashing as it relates specifically to natural gas. It's still a fossil fuel. You're still releasing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and methane is even more potent than CO2. My understanding is that methane leaking over the course of extraction and transportation makes it difficult to really truly know the environmental impact of natural gas, though I do think that it is felt to be cleaner than coal. I feel that we should be investing more heavily in local clean energy, renewable resources like solar and offshore wind. And when it comes to climate change, I trust the scientific experts out there. As a physician, I include myself in the scientific community. I feel there's an urgent need to reduce greenhouse emissions to mitigate the effects of climate change. I don't think that that's reflected in Dominion's plan as much as I would like it to be. I do understand the line of thought in using natural gas as a mean for transitioning and using existing resources in place, but I don't think that South Carolina should invest so heavily on fossil fuels, and I don't think that's the responsible choice, nor do I think it takes into account the best interests of Dominion customers, both current and future. Thank you so much.
Mr. Kitch, thank you for your testimony. Let me check to see if anyone has any questions. Commissioners? Commissioner Justin Williams.
You can call me Justin Thomas Williams.
Can you hit a golf ball, though?
No. Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Kitch, thank you for joining us this morning. I just wanted to inquire a little bit about how you obtained access to Dominion's IRP report.
It was posted trying to remember exactly the site that I was looking through, but I looked at the one that was posted publicly online.
Did you find it easily accessible?
It was a little challenging to find, and also, I mean, it's lengthy. I kind of wish that there was more of a sort of summarized version where you could kind of just see the highlights. It's a little difficult to navigate. I'm trying to. I can't actually remember the link that I found the resource through, though. It may have been through Dominion's page.
Understood.
Yeah.
Considering that you're a physician and your level of education is probably above average, what did you think about reading the report? Was it an easy read and easy to understand for you, or did you find it difficult to consume and digest?
Quite honestly, I mean that had been something that I was didn't mention directly, but I've been kind of thinking as I was going through. I mean, it is a little challenging to. I mean, it took some time to really sit down, and I didn't read the entire thing, but skimming through it. Yeah, I mean, it was a little challenging to navigate, and it kind of be nice to have sort of just like a summarized version at some point, with just kind of all the key points, which I didn't really get I didn't really see that, but that would certainly be very helpful.
Thank you, sir. Understanding your position on fossil fuel and renewable energy, was there any positive takeaways from the report?
I do. I understand that. I do think that moving in the direction of natural gas is a at least an effort and a step in the right direction. I guess I'd just like to see more of a definitive push towards. I apologize. That's my dog. Some more definitive steps, specifically towards definitively renewable resources.
Thank you, Dr. Kitch. Madam Chair, that's all I have.
Yes.
Thank you,
guys.
Thank you, Commissioner Williams. Is it Dr. or Mr. Kitch? I'm sorry.
Either way, you can call me Dr. Kitch or Mr. Kitch. But
I apologize. I didn't pick up on that. But in your testimony, you indicated you consider yourself part of the scientific community. Can you tell me? Can you explain that a little bit?
So just having a background in science and biology and sort of understanding the scientific process and sort of having a sense of how we learn about the world around us and understand it's a constantly kind of evolving process. And I think there's a lot as far as climate change is concerned. I feel like it's sort of become this politicized issue, and people have very strong opinions about it one way or another. But I think it's important that, and that sort of thing has happened in the medical field, as well. There's kind of a loss of trust, I think, within people who are experts in that field, and there's a tendency to go online and do independent research and feel like you are somehow achieving sort of the same level of expertise. And I know there are still a fairly in some realms, South Carolina being included, there's still a lot of controversy about how much it's actually impacting us, how much it's driving a lot of the environmental changes that we're seeing. But I fall back on specifically the people and the scientists who are directly researching this and trust their understanding their research directly, and I've been concerned about a lot of the things that I'm reading and seeing, and for that reason, I really think that there should be more of an urgent push, particularly, and I think South Carolina has the potential to be a leader in that transition. To make these changes sooner rather than later. And so that's kind of my perspective. But yeah, I mean, I'm not directly involved in doing climate research or anything specifically, but I come from a background that's based in science.
Thank you, Dr. Kitch.
Yeah.
We appreciate your time this morning and your testimony, and I don't see any further questions, and I hope you have a good day. Thank you very much.
Thank you again for being so accommodating. Sorry about the timing and everything.
Thank you, sir. Have a good day.
Yeah, you too. Bye.
Madam Chair, sorry, this is Chris Huber from ORS. This is not a question for Mr. Kitch, but or Dr. Kitch.
Well, he's gone, so I hope that it's not.
It's really a housekeeping matter. Traditionally, ORS has requested, and the Commission has included the sign-in or sign-up sheets from public hearings, such as this morning and the two yesterday, in the record. I wanted to request that.
Thank you, Mr. Huber. That will be any objection? Hearing exhibit number 4 will be the sign-in sheets from the customer hearings. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Marked for identification and admitted into evidence. Okay.
Madam Chair, that concludes our list of pre-registrants for today's session.
Thank you, Mr. Bachman. Let's see. We are still on our first panel of Ms. Best, Mr. Walker, and Ms. Parker. Are we ready to proceed? Mr. Ziegler?
We're ready to proceed.
Thank you. Ask them to return to the witness chairs. Lady and gentlemen, I'll remind you that you're still under oath. Don't have to swear you again today, but I do remind you. Where we left off last evening, we were in commissioner questions for the panel, and I think we were on Commissioner Carolee Williams.
Thank you, Chair Belzer. Good morning. My questions are really for anybody on the panel. I suspect a few more of them will be answered by Ms. Best, but I welcome anybody's answer. I want to clarify some of the testimony from yesterday related to the Williams plant. I heard 2030 as a best case retirement date, and I think I also heard no sooner than 2030. Can you clarify what goes into that thinking and what the realities are? Understanding it's 2023.
Yes, so when we performed the 2022 coal plants retirement study, we did an analysis. And through the work that was done by Mr. Parker's group in the 2021 TIA, the Transmission Impact Analysis, we determined that it was based on the time for transmission to be interconnected, that it would be not feasible to retire that plant before 2030. So that meant 12/31/2030. So that's the reasons for that. We had initially in our earlier plan had kind of a targeted the 28 date, but once we had completed the coal plants retirement study, it was determined that that was the earliest feasible, if practical.
So the real answer to my question, I think, is earliest feasible, if practical.
Yes, ma'am. Practical.
If I might add,
Please do.
the retirement will be dictated by the availability of replacement resources, and that will include the completion of the necessary electric transmission upgrades to support bringing that resource online. So for the purposes of the retirement study, the assumed preferred replacement resource would be a large combined cycle generating facility assumed to be located at the company's former Kennedy's coal-fired facility. The study that was conducted by Mr. Parker's group indicated that the time to construct the electric transmission upgrades to support bringing a facility online at that facility would drive the schedule. It's possible that that could come in terms of schedule, could push out. There's a lot of factors at play that were discussed at the retirement study. Electric transmission was basically the long pole in the tent, as we like to say in the engineering world, of what's driving the critical path of the schedule.
So is it your best guess that based on replacing Williams, that the end of 2030 is the most likely achievable date at this point?
That would be the earliest achievable date, yes, ma'am.
May I just add, with
Sorry.
with regard to transmission? So, yes, just with a couple of caveats. Since those reports have been done, I mean, the lead times for major transmission equipment are getting longer, not shorter. In some cases, big transformers, circuit breakers are now 3-year lead time just from the time you order them. The other caveat that we mentioned about Williams, in terms of, you're asking about best case, is in the report we say, what we estimate the time needed to order, design, build, get necessary approval from you folks on the certificate of need. That is still a best case. We factor all that in, but what we can't predict is, given Williams' location and all the growth and load down there may be limitations on when we can work on the transmission lines that need to be rebuilt or new ones, because taking some lines out to work on them or rebuild them may cause problems serving the, in the higher load periods, or sometimes even in the maintenance period. So we can't predict that until we have a work schedule, but that's why we say best case, because there could be that sort of best case without any construction delays. Those would be estimated later when they kind of have a plan of how they would work the upgrades when those are finalized.
And I really mean to be asking, not best case, but what do you think is doable?
So as we put in our letter last week to you to give you kind of an update on where we are on our RFP, we're evaluating the bids right now, obviously, and Mr. Walker is part of that group that's evaluating those bids. We have reason to believe that we can get natural gas, and I appreciated the testimony from the earlier public witness, because he did mention the need for natural gas as a as a transition to a cleaner energy. So we recognize that that's going to be probably the solution that we're going to need. So Mr. Parker, speaking to the transmission piece, there's also a natural gas component that we must have. Because of the criticality of Williams, we have to have replacement generation in place before we retire that unit.
And you just testified you have reason to believe that you will have the natural gas necessary.
We've had productive discussions with the pipeline suppliers. Mr. Walker may want to expand some more on that. Obviously, all that's confidential at this point in time, but we have no reason to believe that critical path would not be appropriate for that timeline.
I could add that we've received a robust response to the request for proposals, the joint RFP that was issued by the company as well as Santee Cooper to identify potential natural gas supply to meet the needs of a joint resource, as well as Santee Cooper included in the RFP potential gas supply for their Hampton site that they're interested in potentially developing, as well as incremental supply to support the company's local distribution company, the LDC. There's no fatal flaws seen at this point with respect to the ability of the existing interstate pipeline companies to be able to provide incremental supply to the state. The biggest unknown is schedule. I believe Ms. Jackson spoke to this last week during the gas rate case. We just live in unprecedented times. I'm sure we're all tired of hearing that term, but the pipeline permitting process is extremely challenging. It's heavily litigated. There's a lot of unknowns that come in that. We're hopeful that Mountain Valley Pipeline is finally going to complete here in the coming months. That'll be a tremendous benefit to customers in the southeast of providing access to low-cost natural gas supplies. But the pipeline projects that have been proposed through this RFP are primarily along existing rights-of-way are not contemplating greenfield builds. So that is one aspect as we go through our evaluations, is understanding the risk profile of it's a comprehensive evaluation of not just cost but overall risks of and a big piece of that is permitting risk and constructability risk, which drives schedule.
One more thing I wanted to add is with regard of all the scenarios that we've studied to date around Williams, the Kennedy site was the one that offered the least expensive and quickest time to construct with minimal new right of way. That's one of the reasons we liked it. But so that's why that's sort of best case going there. Other scenarios took longer, more time and cost.
Remind me of the lifetime of can I call it just the Kennedy's combined cycle plant or the shared resource?
So I don't believe that we assume a lifetime in the time span of the IRP of, it's an interesting question with respect to what a new natural gas-fired resource would be, how it would be handled from a depreciation standpoint of technical useful life of, I'd encourage you to look at the probable retirement dates that are in the IRP for the Jasper and Columbia Energy Center facilities. That would probably be indicative of what the anticipated useful life of a new facility would be. It would likely be comparable. But one thing we haven't talked about yet in this proceeding around new natural gas-fired facilities is the potential to adapt them to utilizing hydrogen. Now that's a piece that's a little bit controversial as part of the greenhouse gas rule that's been proposed by EPA. It's the position of many utilities that EPA is assuming a very aggressive conversion of existing natural gas facilities to utilizing hydrogen by the mid-2030s. There's a significant supply chain that will need to develop to support that, but it is quite possible that any new natural gas facilities that the company would construct would be able to be converted to hydrogen and would have a very long useful life utilizing that fuel with no carbon emissions.
And Mr. Neely would have assumed a useful life in his modeling, so when he comes up, he'd probably be more than happy to kind of answer that specific question.
He's smiling like he expected.
He's probably thinking I'm going to pass that question along to him. So,
okay.
Although we couldn't talk, I think he realized that he has a few assignments today.
Okay, that sounds good. Does the company look at the long-term savings associated with clean energy, health impacts, lessening flooding, agriculture? We've heard a lot of it in the past from the customers that have called in. I understand carbon tax, but this is something I don't hear anybody talk about, but I just wanted to put it out there in the table.
So when we did the comprehensive coal retirement study, it wasn't just looking at a levelized net present value. We did have an economic impact study and what it does to that part of the community. Specifically answering to the question that you have, I'm not party to any discussions that we've had specific to that question, but I can tell you that the comprehensiveness of that study that was done did evaluate the economic impact.
So one thing I'd add is when EPA does rulemaking, like any federal agency, they have to do a cost-benefit analysis. And part of that is they're looking at health benefits. So with respect to the greenhouse gas rule, they're looking at CO2 impacts with respect to how it's regulated under the Clean Air Act, when they're looking at other what they call criteria pollutants regulated under the Clean Air Act. Particulate matter, I heard one of the public witnesses discuss PM 2.5, an important pollutant of when EPA sets regulations, they're using epidemiological studies to determine societal costs to justify their rulemaking. That's a large part of what's litigated heavily when these rules are challenged, is the science behind that or how those cost assumptions are built up. But so when those regulations are driving the company's decision-making processes around the resources, those benefits are baked in because of the regulations that are driving us towards those resource changes. Now, with respect to CO2 costs and impacts around climate change, that's why we look at sensitivities for different costs. But when we model a carbon tax, we're not modeling where that would go, of whether that's for improving resiliency or improving the ability to withstand changes from climate. It's just modeling that cost being borne by our customers, of where that would ultimately end up and how that would be utilized is outside of the purview of our studies.
So in other words, may not necessarily be part of the IRP, but we do have an environmental organization within our company that evaluates any impact that we have in environmental justice, because that was obviously discussed earlier as well.
This question is shifting gears and looking at the scenarios. And so this may not be the right panel to ask the question of, but you can tell me who to ask it of. It looked like you weren't looking at lower fuel cost there's like there's a medium and a high scenario. And so I was curious why you didn't look at a lower fuel cost, and then also what kind of cost you looked at when you modeled the medium and high scenarios. And also in that bucket, did you also consider fuel availability?
So Mr. Neely can definitely speak to what the inputs were used as part of the order coming out of the 2020 IRP. We were ordered to use readily available sources for those fuel price forecasts. I'd point out there's asymmetry between these different cases. There's a heavy focus by many parties on those high fossil fuel cases, of the risks associated with that. There's an asymmetry of there's a risk of low fossil fuel prices, like as we're seeing throughout the 2010s, of if you went back to 2006, 2007, nobody would have predicted what natural gas prices were going to do in 2010, 2011. And so it's important to recognize that not all of those scenarios have equal probability, but Mr. Neely, I think, would be well suited to speak to that.
So Mr. Walker was responding to that. I went back to the 8 market scenarios, and we do have a scenario that's the electrification scenario. That is a low fuel scenario that Mr. Neely could speak to. So we do evaluate lower fuel costs under that market scenario.
Thank you. It's hard to keep up with it all.
There's a lot of information to absorb.
Now I'm going to shift to batteries. In the 2024 IRP update, how would you imagine that battery cost and storage cost might implicate, given recent changes, the NREL data that I think Ms. Best has mentioned, and then there was some NREL data mentioned by a customer calling in. And feel free to answer that however you want to. You got the general gist of the question.
Yes, ma'am. So as mentioned in some of the testimony that has been filed, there's obviously been updates to the NREL forecast from 22 to 23, and we recognize and quantify that change. And obviously that's an input to to the assumptions that we do in our modeling. On Table 13, on page 52 of the IRP, we list the generation supplies technology as well as a source of data. And so what will happen is Mr. Neely will reference the most recent source of data when he's modeling the 24 IRP update, but you'll be able to see kind of where we're referencing those industry sources as ordered by the commission. So we would be updating those inputs.
And with the 2024 IRP, have you use 2021, 2022 data, and will the 2024 IRP have 2022, 2023 data? It will have the higher cost data.
It will have the most recent forecast that's available at the time, and so I don't think we'll have anything beyond the 23 subject to check for the battery cost, but that's what we would be using. Yes, ma'am.
Are you aware of NREL predicting lower battery cost in the future?
That would be a good question for Mr. Neely. He stays very connected to that.
Okay. Are the costs that we're seeing that are predicted today, are they such that they're likely to make battery use uneconomical?
I would say that the batteries that are being selected in the models are really to support the significant amount of solar build that we're adding to, which is creating that cleaner energy future that a lot of the public testimony has asked for and requested. But Mr. Neely can kind of give you the puts and takes of how costs go up and how the resources are selected. But again, the batteries are selected to be able to support the charging of the solar that's being added to our system.
Okay. How does a company like you all gain experience with batteries? Are there pilots? Do you make small investments? Do you read?
We actually have 3 signed PPAs currently right now that we expect by the middle of 24 that we should have around just slightly under 100 megawatts of battery. So that'll give us some experience as far as how that impacts our system. So that's how we're kind of entering the stage of batteries on our system right now. So as you can imagine, we've got a lot of lessons to be learned before we're able to interconnect to the level that we have incorporated in our modeling. But that's certainly a way we have. Obviously, we gain experience from Virginia because Virginia has seen some batteries as well, and so we're in constant communication with that. Mr. Walker, you have any thoughts to add?
If I might add, we already have a very large energy storage resource on our system that we've been operating since the 1970s. Fairfield Pump Storage is essentially a massive 8-hour battery that's critical for us to be able to operate our system day in, day out with the amount of solar that's on our system. If you compare regionally to utilities, if you compare our system to Santee Cooper's system, Santee Cooper has not seen the solar build out that we've seen on the DESC system. And part of that is they're not blessed with the topography that we are in our service territory that supports having a large pump storage asset. Of the Duke Carolinas companies got tremendous pump storage resources that were built in the upstate in the 70s and in the 90s with Bad Creek. So as a utility operator, we have a lot of experience operating energy storage. Now, with respect to batteries as a technology, I agree with Ms. Best. We're monitoring what's going on in Virginia. Our subsidiary there has a state mandate under statute to build out a certain amount of battery energy storage. They're steadily working on that. We stay abreast of what's going on in the industry through the Electric Power Research Institute. We're members of a number of programs inside of EPRI that are monitoring not just traditional lithium ion or zinc chemistry batteries, but other novel forms of long-term energy storage. Heard one of the public witnesses discuss the Form Energy long duration iron air batteries. That's very exciting technology that may be commercially available in the coming years. It's not presently commercially available or deployed at scale, but we're watching all of these.
I'm glad I asked.
I would like to add from a transmission perspective, we do are anticipating getting that valuable operating experience with the batteries. That there's one that is co-located with solar now. The solar is online, the battery is not yet online, but we do want to get that valuable operating experience. We recognize batteries as a valuable tool for, as Mr. Walker said, the one we have at Fairfield is invaluable, but the application has to be right. I mean, and Fairfield, for instance, rarely, if ever, there are no transmission constraints. It can be charged and discharged as needed to allow for a lot of solar. What you don't want is transmission constraints that can constrain you from being able to use that battery, charge it like it needs to be, so that you can balance the system. The application has to be right. We found several, the one that's imminent on our system, another one coming next year. So I did want to say we do have batteries coming, not necessarily just what's shown out in the future in the IRP.
One last thing I'll add to Mr. Parker's comment of one thing that's exciting about the IRA is that it allows battery storage to be charged from the grid. So third-party projects, the first one that we're expecting to come on our system is charged only from the solar on site. It's not able to be charged more than a very small amount of time under the tax regime that project was built under. The IRA now makes it where there's the ability for developers, third-party developers, or the company to self-build batteries that are charged from the grid, so they operate much like Fairfield does, which provides the maximum system benefits. So if you can imagine, if we have a long period where it's cold and cloudy for a week at a time at a facility that's got solar and batteries, if that facility's got batteries that we can grid charge, we can use that, charge it at night using thermal resources, and use that to dispatch during our peak. So that's a positive policy change coming out of the tax code that's going to benefit our customers and give us a more reliable system.
And I think, no, not my last question, but almost my last question. I'm going to switch gears now to Watery. And the process that you will undertake for replacing it. Remind me of the options that you're considering for Watery. What's the process for replacing it? How are you involving stakeholders to make sure that they're aware of the steps that you're taking? And you've mentioned the ERCOT process several times. What have you, and that will help enable you to move forward more quickly, but what have you learned from that as well?
I'm going to start with that, and then I'm going to pivot to Mr. Walker because he'd be able to kind of enhance any of my responses. So in our IRP, we have 2 build plans for Watery that are envisioned. One is a battery at Watery, and then the other would be a CT at ERCOT with an additional battery at Watery. So those 2 plans, when modeled under the inputs and assumptions that we had, were very close. And when you look at the various plans that were selected, some selected the battery and some selected the CT. So we knew that those were 2 viable options, which is why we felt like that would be good for us to evaluate with market data under an all-source RFP for the Watery that Mr. Walker can speak to as from the ERCOT that we're using as kind of that framework. I was asked a question yesterday and was probably unprepared to respond to about the Williams piece, but there's a difference between a single source procurement and an all source procurement. So a single source procurement, which is what probably will be envisioned for Williams, that relates to for a specific need, whether it's a locational constraint or a base load constraint. And as Mr. Parker has in his testimony, Williams has a locational constraint. So for the Watery, we will have an all-source RFP that will follow the framework of the ERCOT RFP at the time that's completed. So I'm going to pass it over to my colleague.
So to the extent, once the ERCOT process is constructively completed, that will allow the company to potentially move forward with issuing an all-source RFP for Watery. As best describes, the IRP looked at different scenarios, but the company's not putting forth one or the other as the definitive option of Those battery prices are NREL data. They're not based from actual bids from actual developers in our state building at actual sites. We feel like it's very important to, when making those definitive resource decisions, they need to be based on actual market data, not models from NREL.
So are you saying that in the case of Wateree, it will be an all-source RFP that identifies the two options that you have mentioned
Yes.
in this IRP?
They will have the opportunity to bid into that all sources RFP, and then the process will determine which would be the most optimal solution for the Wateree.
So an all sources RFP does not define what the technology requirement is. It's technology neutral, it's technology agnostic. It states a need in terms of capacity. So for Wateree, it would represent, as modeled in this IRP, approximately a 400 megawatt capacity need, may specify duration, may have other constraints on it. The ERCOT process had some specific constraints on it outside of a capacity need of a requirement for black start capability. That's not the case for a Wateree replacement because that facility doesn't have black start capability. But the concept with an all source RFP is you set the need in a technology neutral way, and then you allow all technologies to come to the forefront. The two that are most sensical to meet what is assumed to be the need for a Wateree retirement are simple cycle CTs, batteries, hybrid solar facilities have a role in that as well. But the solar piece of that doesn't provide any real capacity contribution. The batteries are the critical piece of it. That's not to say that someone might not have a wind project that they could bid in, or demand response. There could be someone that could bring a demand side solution that might be able to be part of an overall optimized portfolio solving for what that ultimate need is. But that's the beauty of an all source process, is you're looking at everything that can be brought to the table inside the time frame and the constraints that are identified at the outset of the process.
I appreciate the kind way that you corrected me and learning from you. So thank you. I think I'm on to my last question. And this has to do with the greenhouse gas potential law. What assurances are out there that customers will not be faced with paying higher fuel prices due to the higher hydrogen blending mandates for gas plants? The potential hydrogen?
The proposal, and I think, would you want to take that?
The company will be required to comply with any regulations that are put forth by EPA and adopted by our state regulator with respect to new resources. That's why we model these sensitivities around regulations. Of this proposed regulation is one that we've, I think, pretty clearly stated that we could take a look at and model in the context of a 2024 IRP update, of do some sensitivity cases around it, bearing in mind that it is a very incomplete proposal. That's a frustrating piece around these proposed regulations that don't believe is well articulated by many parties, as they're frequently kind of half thought, half baked ideas, of a lot of inconsistencies that are found in them, and a lot of the stakeholder discussions that have been going on in the state. I've been party to some of the stakeholder discussions with the Office of Regulatory Staff, DHEC, the Electric Co-op, Central, as well as some of the environmental interests in the state. There's a lot of perverse incentives in the proposed rule, of a lot of conflicting pieces to it. EPA was clearly rushed to try to get something out the door, as they frequently are. Hopefully that they'll take the time over the next couple months to try to straighten out some of those issues. But if we try to purely model what's proposed right now, we may end up with some pretty strange results that may not result in the carbon emissions that are envisioned or desired. Of one common strain that was coming out of stakeholder discussions around the greenhouse gas rule and preparing comments for it by different parties was an option for a state compliance plan. That's a construct in the Clean Air Act for what's called a state implementation plan, where the state regulator, environmental regulator here, DHEC, would allow or would drive the compliance process to where EPA might set a goal, a target that we're trying to reach, but not tell us exactly how we have to do it. It may not be so prescriptive, and allow flexibility in how we can consider different technologies, different resource changes in the construct of an IRP. I think all parties are hopeful that that flexibility will be afforded by a final rule such that it's issued. But with respect to customer protection of, we have to comply with the rules that are issued by federal agencies.
So I'm going to kind of summarize where he went to say, right now that would be speculative on us to be able to talk about kind of where we see that going. Currently, our IRP does comply with any and all environmental regulations, and we do look to find the most affordable, safe, and reliable. So I'm going back to that same statement, but at this point it's a bit speculative until we learn more about that rule.
Thank you very much. I've
Yes,
learned a
ma'am.
lot, and I appreciate your expertise.
Thank you.
Commissioner Justin Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And panel, I'm sorry I didn't ask this question yesterday or earlier yesterday. I can't say that I saw in the IRP a specific position on climate change. And considering the testimony regarding your internal environmental group, I'm interested to know whether or not the company has an official position on climate change.
I can't speak directly to your question. I can say that we do publish a climate report every year, and that report is public, and we do have a sustainability report, but I can't specifically speak to your answer. It is not, I do not think, directly addressed in this IRP.
Okay, and so I'm right then. We're on the same page. I didn't see it in the IRP either, but do you know if the company has a position on climate change?
I can tell you that we have a climate report that's been published that tells us how do we get to a net zero by 2050. And so that would be an improvement to the climate, yes, but I can't speak because I'm not in that department to tell you specifically how do we manage to climate change.
Understand. And so that climate report and how you get to zero carbon by 2050 informs decisions that are contemplated in the IRP. Is that fair to say?
I would characterize it to say that when we prepared the climate report for this year, we looked at both the IRPs in Virginia and South Carolina to see how they would be impacted them. So that would help us drive future directions of ongoing modeling as we go forward in our future IRPs.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Vice Chair Powers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Walker, just a few minutes ago, you mentioned that there was a battery study or battery procedure that you were going through in Virginia because it was legislatively mandated. Is that right?
Yes, sir. My understanding is the Virginia Clean Economy Act, the VCEA, requires a certain amount of battery energy storage build out in the state of Virginia, Commonwealth of Virginia.
Do you think that's the right thing to do?
Personally, believe that legislative direction can be important in attempting to try to meet some of these societal goals that we're looking at here. This is an interesting question to the point Commissioner Williams, I think, was getting at around, does the company have a position on climate change? These are public policy issues that really are best handled by the General Assembly, and same in Virginia. They're the elected officials that represent the voice of the people, and that's where a lot of these mandates should flow down from. It's not the role of the company in trying to run a least cost planned system or reliable system to be advancing the potential or the political views of certain groups. If we're responsible for serving all customers. So I understand the construct in Virginia of the General Assembly there was ostensibly speaking for the will of the people, and I think if that's what the people of Virginia want, that's a good way of achieving those goals.
So when one state takes the position as Virginia has, is that a benefit to South Carolina? Or would South Carolina have to have its own legislation in order to get the same treatment or consideration?
So I'm not aware of any requirements by our General Assembly and statute right now that dictate our resource build in South Carolina. As a subsidiary of Dominion, we have access to the know-how and knowledge that's being gleaned from executing on the strategy to meet the goals in that jurisdiction. But our customers aren't bearing those costs but we do have the opportunity as a larger entity to gain from their experience.
So you can learn and benefit from what happens in another state that happens to be part of your company.
Absolutely. I'd point to right now the construction projects that we've got going on here in South Carolina, building replacement units at the Bushy Park and Parr sites. The construction team that's on site today at those facilities was integral into building new natural gas facilities in Virginia in the 2010s. They've brought that know-how and that expertise to South Carolina and is helping us execute on that to deliver for our customers and our benefit.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Commissioner Caston?
One follow-up question, I guess. I think in your rebuttal testimony, and the question on batteries kind of triggered that thought. You'd made a comment, I wrote it somewhere, using solar to recharge hypothetical batteries. You stated it would take tens of thousands of acres, and that's based on 5 to 10 acres per megawatt AC. You know, I've heard all kind of numbers. Is 5 to 10 acres per megawatt? Now, interesting. Well, answer that. Is that still accurate? I mean.
So Mr. Neely may be able to speak to this a little bit better, but my understanding is the existing utility scale solar facilities that we have on our system, bear in mind we have roughly 1,000 megawatts AC of existing utility scale solar projects on our system, that their land use requirements are in that range. If it varies topography, whether or not they're using trackers, panel design, there's ways to have efficiency to have a smaller footprint but that's been the range that's been seen with the projects that have been coming online in our jurisdiction.
So Mr. Neely is the one that would better answer this, you say?
He could speak to the land use a little bit, but one thing I'd point out is the company didn't conduct a model that assumed the retirement and replacement of Williams with just solar and batteries. Of other parties in this proceeding have conducted their modeling of such. I believe one of the witnesses has presented in their testimony that such a replacement of Williams would require approximately 4,000 megawatts of solar and several hundred megawatts of battery storage. So one can extrapolate if 4,000 megawatts of solar were required. If you use 5 acres per megawatt as the baseline, that'd be roughly 20,000 acres of land use requirement to build that solar.
Okay, now in previous hearings, I've also heard that typically a solar farm, at least maybe in this part of the country, maybe others, I don't know, is typically over-designed 30 to 100%. Does that 5 to 10 acres, 4,000 megawatts times that, does that include that over-design, or is that not including the over-design?
That's looking at the AC rating of a facility. So yes, that would be incorporating the over-paneling to where they're using higher DC to AC ratios depending on the design of the facility. If you look at the facilities on our system right now, it's a range of how much different facilities are overbuilt, but that 5 to 10 acres per megawatt that's in my testimony is based off of what's on the system right now, and that's AC rating.
So the AC rating, not the DC rating.
Yes.
But again, as I understood it from previous hearings, the DC rating is 30 to 100% over-designed to get to the AC rating. So am I misunderstanding that or misunderstanding you?
No, sir. So what I'm discussing the land use, it's on an AC basis of that's incorporating that overbuild from a DC rating standpoint.
That incorporates that
Yes.
over, okay. Okay. No more questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Caston. Looks like nothing. Any redirect?
No redirect, Chairman
Thank you.
Belson.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your testimony. You may stand down.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're going. Mr. Ziegler?
Dominion Energy South Carolina would now call its second panel, James Neely and Nicholas Wintermantle.
Gentlemen, court reporter will swear you in.
If you would raise your right hands, please. Do you solemnly affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Mr. Ziegler? Would you turn that microphone on, please?
Thank you, Chairman Belson. Let me direct my questions to Mr. Neely. Would you please state your name for the record?
James W. Neely.
By whom are you employed and in what capacity?
I'm employed by Dominion Energy Services as the Energy Market Strategic Advisor.
And Mr. Neely, have you prepared direct testimony under your supervision and authority of 37 pages that has been pre-filed in the docket of this proceeding?
Yes, I have.
And am I correct that there are no exhibits to that testimony?
That's correct.
Are there any corrections to that testimony?
No.
Mr. Neely, if I were to ask you the questions contained in that pre-filed direct testimony today, would your answers be the same?
Yes.
Chair Belser, I'd move Mr. Neely's direct pre-filed testimony into the record of this proceeding.
Mr. Neely's pre-filed direct testimony will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
And Mr. Neely, have you prepared a summary of that direct testimony?
Yes, I have.
Would you please deliver it to the commission and the parties?
Chair Belzer and members of the commission, my direct testimony discusses the structure and methodologies used to model resources for DESC's 2023 IRP. Certain key inputs, as well as the analysis of the resulting build plans under 8 specific measures of cost, CO2 emissions, plus other factors. In consultation with stakeholders, DESC defined 8 market scenarios that reflect an internally consistent narrative about load growth, fuel prices, carbon prices, and DSM effectiveness. Collectively, the 8 market scenarios encompass a broad spectrum of future conditions potentially affecting DESC's electric system. The Plexos model optimized DESC's generation system under each of those scenarios to create 8 individual bill plans. DESC created 6 additional bill plans by setting specific parameters or constraints to evaluate. DESC selected 5 of the optimized bill plans for the core analysis, a comparative evaluation that represent a range of wide but plausible future conditions. These 5 core bill plans are the reference bill plan, the zero carbon cost bill plan, the high fossil fuel prices bill plan, the 70% CO2 reduction bill plan, and the 85% CO2 reduction bill plan. DESC evaluated the 5 core bill plans under 3 core market scenarios, each of which represents a range of assumptions that encompasses reasonable and indicative future conditions. To allow for a meaningful comparison of cost and emissions, all 3 core market scenarios assumed reference load growth and a medium level of DSM. Plexos' hourly dispatch model determined the cost of each of the core bill plans and CO2 emissions. The remaining 9 non-core bill plans serve as sensitivities to evaluate options for Watery or Williams retirements and replacements, to provide statutory or commission-mandated information, or to measure how bill plans vary depending on changes in fuel cost, CO2 cost, load growth, and DSM effectiveness. The 14 bill plans and 24 cases are shown on this chart. The 5 core bill plans and the 15 core cases are shown in blue. The sensitivity bill plans and cases are shown in light green, and the supplemental bill plans and cases are shown in light orange. The IRP assessed the core bill plans against 8 specific metrics, which are levelized cost, CO2 emissions, clean energy, fuel cost resiliency, generation diversity, reliability factors, mini-max regret, and cost range. This core analysis shows that across all 15 core cases, the reference bill plan had the lowest or second lowest cost to customers, expressed as the levelized net present value cost per year for generation supply. The zero carbon cost bill plan, which assumes no future cost for CO2 emissions, scored lowest in one market scenario and second in the other 2. But the levelized net present value cost difference between those 2 bill plans was relatively small, less than 2%. This next chart shows the levelized net present value scoring of the core bill plans. The 85% CO2 reduction bill plan has the highest cost across all 3 market scenarios by a wide margin, with an annual cost between $411 million and $529 million more annually than the reference bill plan under each market scenario. The difference between the 85% CO2 reduction bill plan and the reference bill plan for each market scenario was an increase of between 19 and 29%. Regarding carbon emissions, the 85% CO2 reduction bill plan achieves the greatest CO2 emissions reduction of the core bill plans, producing a large reduction in CO2 emissions from 2005 levels, but at a higher cost. Among the other bill plans, CO2 emissions reductions vary between 55% and 63% from 2005 levels, with a zero carbon cost bill plan having the lowest average reduction. Over the planning horizon, the core bill plans add non-emitting resources totaling between 80% and 87% of nameplate megawatts of generation additions. Specifically, the reference bill plan adds 6,625 megawatt of non-emitting resources, principally solar, or a little more than 80% of the total megawatt added under that bill plan. All core bill plans envision DESC adding substantial quantities of solar on a roughly annual basis beginning in 2026 and supplemented by battery beginning in 2028. On a nameplate megawatt basis, solar and battery combined are the principal resources added under all core bill plans. Although most of the resources added are non-emitting resources, the modeling shows that natural gas dispatchable generation is also needed to support reliability and supply low-cost energy. Retiring the Watering Williams coal units requires the addition of gas-fired generation to maintain reliability under each core bill plan, including the carbon-constrained bill plans. The Energy Conservation Bill Plan, which is proposed by stakeholder groups and which contains optimistic assumptions about the potential ability of DSM programs and other efficiency measures to eliminate future demand growth, also determined that gas-fired generation would be required in the near term to support the coal retirements. All core bill plans add a significant amount of renewable generation. Under the reference market scenario, each of the core bill plans includes 59% and 68% renewable generation capacity in 2050. That's between 59 and 68% renewable generation capacity in 2050. In the supplemental cases, DESC evaluated two possible approaches for replacing Wateree. Assuming it can be retired by December 31st, 2028, the two primary approaches identified by Plexos are adding either 400 megawatt of battery storage, which is the Wateree battery bill plan, or a 262 megawatt large frame combustion turbine, along with 100 megawatts of battery storage, which is the Wateree CT bill plan. Each are supplemented by large amounts of solar. The Wateree CT bill plan includes electric transmission interconnection cost of $180 million from the 2022 Transmission Impact Analysis, or TIA, request. The Wateree battery bill plan includes zero transmission cost as an assumption and is based on the 2022 NREL battery cost forecast. The modeling shows that the Wateree bill plan is lower cost of the two options, but the cost difference is a relatively small 1.25%. The Wateree battery bill plan has modestly higher CO2 emissions, primarily due to the timing difference related to battery and CT additions and the available system resources from which standalone battery energy storage would charge. Adopting the reference bill plan as the preferred plan under this 23 IRP does not eliminate either alternative and makes no prejudgment between them. DESC plans to select the ultimate mix of replacement resources to replace Wateree and Williams based on actual cost. For Williams, Plexos identified the optimal replacement to be a highly efficient natural gas-fired combined cycle resource, shared 50-50 with Santee Cooper. As a rule of thumb, a combined cycle unit is approximately 35% more efficient than a combustion turbine unit, resulting in lower fuel costs and emissions. The shared resource was identified by Plexos as the optimal replacement resource for Williams in 10 of the 12 bill plans that modeled an early Williams retirement. The two carbon-constrained bill plans selected a 1325 megawatt combined cycle unit, with DESC having full ownership rather than shared. DESC evaluated keeping Williams online until 2047 and found that compared to the reference plan, retiring Williams by 2030 reduces the annual levelized net present value costs by approximately 1.32%. and reduces cumulative CO2 emissions over the planning horizon by 3%. Even under the high fossil fuels market price scenario, retiring Williams by 2030 reduced costs while reducing cumulative CO2 emissions. The reference bill plan is the lowest cost option with the lowest regret score of any plan under the reference market scenario, which represents DESC's assessment of the likely conditions to be encountered during the planning period. The only bill plan that is comparable in terms of cost considerations under any of the three core market scenarios is the zero carbon cost bill plan, which only outperforms the reference bill plan as to cost or regrets under the assumption that carbon emissions remain zero for the duration of the planning period. This is not an assumption on which DESC believes it should base its generation planning at this time. The carbon-constrained bill plans outperform the reference bill plan on most measures of CO2 emissions reductions and clean energy, but their costs are significantly higher than the reference bill plan. The modeling shows that the reference plan is the superior plan in terms of cost and risk. This chart shows the full ranking of the core bill plans under all 8 metrics. Concerning the inputs used in this modeling, in all scenarios, at least 662 megawatt of additional capacity must be online before Williams is retired, which supports the decision to make ELG upgrades so that Williams can continue to operate. This chart shows the principal modeling inputs for each of the 24 cases. DESC is based its natural gas price forecast on the reported prices of publicly traded NYMEX Henry Hub contracts for the first 3 years of the planning horizon, then incorporated the gas forecast provided by IHS North American Power Market Outlook. The medium CO2 price is based on the IHS U.S. power sector forecast and it assumes a $9.62 per metric ton of CO2 price starting in 2030, which escalates to more than $45 a ton by 2050. The high CO2 price assumes that a CO2 price starts 2 years earlier in 2028 and is 50% higher, or $14.43 per metric ton, than the IHS forecast. This price escalates to $80 a ton by 2050. This level of CO2 prices generates significant costs for customers and the system. The zero CO2 price creates a CO2 sensitivity against which all other bill plans can be evaluated, and assumes the continuation of current state and federal policies that do not put any explicit price on CO2 emissions. In consultation with stakeholders, DESC modeled 12 generating resources plus 2 demand response resources. These resources included 2 configurations of standalone battery capacity, 2 configurations of standalone solar capacity, 3 configurations of combustion turbines, 3 configurations of combined cycle units, offshore wind, and small modular reactors. Solar resources are modeled as PPA resources in addition to utility-owned resources. The costs of solar and battery resources reflect tax benefits from the recently enacted Inflation Reduction Act, with assumed safe harbor extensions for uncompleted projects at the end of the program. The 2 demand response programs are modeled as resources using cost data provided by the 2023 DSM potential study. This concludes my summary of my direct testimony.
Mr. Neely, have you also prepared rebuttal testimony of 35 pages that was pre-filed in the record of this proceeding?
I have.
And are there any corrections or additions to that pre-filed rebuttal testimony?
Yes. In my testimony as pre-filed, I stated that the National Renewable Energy Laboratories had increased their forecast of the cost of battery storage resources by 45%. The correct number is 37%. So I have
Can you give
changed.
us a page number and line that we need to be correcting?
It's page 24, line 17.
Thank you.
The correct
Sorry,
number.
Mr. Neal.
The correct number is 37%. So I've changed the 45% to 37% on line 24, line 17. In addition, witness Gravatt pointed out that I conflated the incremental DSM savings discussed in my rebuttal testimony with the cumulative savings that result from those incremental savings, and I have confirmed that this is correct. In response, I'm changing my pre-filed rebuttal testimony on page 25, line 10, to change 30 times higher to read 3 times higher. On that same page, line 11, Delete the end of the sentence starting with the words 20 times through the end of the sentence that ends with the words witness Jim Gravatt proposed on line 13. And to delete page 25, line 19 through page 27, line 8.
Page 25 through 27, line 8?
Delete page 25, line 19 through page 27, line 8.
Thank you.
Mr. Neely, having made those changes, if I were to ask you the same questions today that are contained in your pre-filed rebuttal testimony, would your answers be the same?
Yes.
Chairman Belcher, I would move Mr. Neely's corrected pre-filed rebuttal testimony into the record at this time.
Mr. Neely's pre-filed rebuttal testimony as corrected on the stand will be admitted into the record as if given orally.
And Mr. Neely, are there exhibits to your pre-filed rebuttal testimony?
Yes, there are 2 exhibits.
Are there any changes or corrections to those exhibits?
No, there is not.
Chairman Belcher, I'd move exhibits JWN1 and JWN2, which are attached to that pre-filed rebuttal testimony, into the record at this time.
Mr. Neely's Mr. Neely's exhibits JN1 and JN2 attached to his pre-filed rebuttal testimony will be marked for identification as hearing exhibit number 5, a composite exhibit of both exhibits. Hearing exhibit number 5 and received into the evidence of this case.
Thank you, Chairman Belcher. Mr. Neely, have you prepared a summary of your rebuttal testimony?
I have.
Would you please deliver that to the commission and to the parties?
Yes. My rebuttal testimony addresses certain portions of the direct testimony of witness Philip Hyatt, which was submitted on behalf of the South Carolina Office of Regulatory Staff, and certain portions of the direct testimony of witness Derek Stenklick, which was submitted on behalf of the South Carolina Conservation League and Southern Alliance for Clean Energy and the Sierra Club. Witness Hyatt is correct that we linked to the wrong forecast file in calculating the low DSM sensitivities. The only bill plan impacted by the correction is the low DSM bill plan, which is a sensitivity only, and the correction does not change anything in the core analysis of the IRP. The correct data has been included as JWN1 of my rebuttal testimony and was also incorporated in the revised IRP submitted by DESC to the Commission on August the 4th. It is also correct that there was an error in selecting the heat rate for certain new combined cycle and combustion turbine resources. The manufacturers provided 2 heat rate factors, and the lower heat rate factor was chosen, which was not the appropriate factor for use in this modeling. The only variable this affects is fuel cost, which is one component of the total cost of a new gas generating unit. Difference is an 11% change in fuel costs for a combined cycle unit, and when other cost factors are considered, results in a change in annual unit cost of 4.3% or a change of only 5.6% in the levelized net present value under the reference case. These changes do not affect the model selection of the new combined cycle resource or the reference case as the preferred plan. This is an issue that DESC will correct in its 2024 IRP update. The main goal of witness Stenklick's testimony is to show that Williams can be fully replaced with standalone storage, demand response, and distributed energy resources. To support his position, he modeled 4 different scenarios using DESC's reference load, medium fuel, and medium CO2 forecast, but adopted other unreasonable assumptions that include overly aggressive assumptions concerning the cost and availability of battery storage. He based his analysis on the 2022 NREL battery costs, which have already been shown by the 23 NREL battery costs to be unreasonably low by 37%. Witness Stenklick also combined unrealistic storage prices with a massive storage build in 1 year, making his modeling results unsupportable. His alternate coal 2029 plan is based on the unreasonable assumption that the transmission infrastructure improvements required to support replacing Williams with only battery and solar assets can be completed by 2029. His alternate coal 2029 plus ER plan is based on inflated DSM load reductions that are orders higher than can be reasonably forecasted. All of Witness Stinklick's adjustments to the model inputs unreasonably favor solar and battery resources and disfavor gas. But even with these errors, Witness Stinklick's portfolio optimization would still select a combined cycle unit to replace Williams after removing his instruction to the program not to do so. This is a strong affirmation that replacing Williams with a combined cycle unit is a logical plan. Building out gas resources is necessary to add solar and storage. Solar and storage alone do not provide the energy capacity, dispatchability, reserves, and other ancillary services needed to build a reliable system. Specifically, solar and storage cannot offset the $309 million estimated transmission cost to replace Williams as estimated in the 21 TIA. As Witness Stinklick claims, the estimate includes locating replacement resources at the Kennedy site where there are existing transmission assets on site which feed directly into the Charleston load center, is approximately 10 miles from a principal switch yard serving the Charleston area and the Low Country in general, and where transmission upgrades can be made using existing transmission right-of-way. Witness Stinklick claims that the IRP is biased towards gas resources. He challenged an unreasonable DESC's use of a 300 megawatt annual bill limit on solar resources using an average capacity factor of 23.5% for solar, assigning full ELC capacity to gas resources, assuming a 50-50 split between self-build versus PPA for new solar resources, not including a 10% bonus credit under the IRA for all new battery resources and 1,200 megawatts of solar resources, and improperly adjusting the up and down times for frame CT and CC units. All of these model inputs and assumptions used by DESC in the 23 IRP are reasonable and appropriate. The annual bill constraint of 300 megawatt for solar is approximately 6% of DESC's peak load. While Duke Energy currently limits annual bill solar to approximately 2.5% of Duke's peak, and Southern Company uses a limit of 5% of their peak. In addition, the 300 megawatt limit is fully consistent with the annual amount of solar that was built on DESC's system in recent years. The 23.5% capacity factor for solar is appropriate because it is based on actual solar farms on the DESC system. In addition, the 22 NREL ATB shows similar capacity factors over the next 10 years, ranging from 23.1 to 24.9. DESC's 23.5% capacity factor is well within that range. In addition, DESC's IRP modeling doesn't incorporate annual degradation for solar, which amounts to about 0.5% per year, and will reduce the actual capacity factor for solar over time. A 50-50 split between utility self-build and PPA solar resources is reasonable because utility self-build is an important component of an integrated utility operating its system reliably and efficiently. Any renewable package needs to include a minimum amount of utility-owned capacity for DESC to fulfill its requirements as a system operator, which includes backstopping third-party resources and making sure that renewable assets are coordinated with transmission assets to get energy to the areas with the load. Rather than rely on a single type of ownership for solar resources to provide power to the company's customers, it is reasonable to rely on a diversified portfolio that includes both the utilities and solar developer projects. Applying the IRA's energy community bonus credit to 1,200 megawatts of solar and 2,100 megawatts of battery storage is unrealistic. The Department of Treasury has recently released a list of the census tracts that qualify as energy communities under IRA. The energy communities that intersect with DESC's service territory are quite small, as shown by the black areas on this map. The largest area located on the west side of the state along the Savannah River is located in the Savannah River site, which is a highly restricted Department of Energy site. The retirement of Watery and Williams could anchor energy communities in their census tracts, but these would be incremental additions to the total available areas. Given these limited areas, it's unreasonable to assume that more than a limited fraction of the solar and battery resources will be available to access the energy community bonus. For planning purposes, it's more accurate to assume that none of the generic solar and battery resources modeled in the IRP will have access to these areas. Witness Stinklick also assumed that the full level of the IRA incentives will be available for renewable and battery resources until 2050. The assumption is inconsistent with the fact that such incentives are intended to be transitional, and a sunset provision is included in the IRA legislation for that reason. Modeling IRA benefits past the sunset date risk over-accounting for the incentives that are driving the transition to non-emitting resources. Regarding the run times of combined cycle units, Witness Stinklick assumes a minimum up and down times in his analysis that are unrealistic. It is not prudent to plan to run these units at these levels, as Witness Stinklick assumes. To operate these units with these short cycle times would result in high levels of thermal stress, expensive additional maintenance costs, and potential long-term reliability issues. The bill plans created by Plexos.
1 second, may I get Mr. Neely some water?
Please.
The bill plans created by Plexos chose a significant level of non-emitting resources. Thank you. As a part of the bill plan, in every portfolio and sensitivity modeled. In fact, the majority of the capacity chosen was non-emitting. But Plexos also chose fossil resources in every portfolio and sensitivity model because under current and forecasted future conditions, they are uniquely able to meet system needs economically and efficiently. That is because significant amounts of dispatchable resources are needed to support the high levels of intermittent renewable resources added to the system. Finally, despite interveners' suggestions, it is not practical or helpful to try to model DESC's transmission system in Plexos. While Plexos has the capability to include some transmission features, it is not a load flow model like those used by transmission planning. It cannot include the level of detail required for effective transmission planning. Modeling transmission in Plexos would require simplifying assumptions that would make its results inferior to those provided by transmission planning, which has the models that can analyze these matters effectively. The most logical way to model transmission is as a component of generation planning. The most logical way to model transmission as a component of generation planning is to do so as DESC does now, by having generation planning identify future generation retirements and additions using Plexos, and then having transmission planning identify the transmission improvements and costs required to support them. This concludes my summary of my rebuttal testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Neely. I will now address my questions to Mr. Wintermantle. Mr. Wintermantle, would you please state your name for the record?
Yes, my name is R. Nicholas Wintermantle.
By whom are you employed and in what capacity?
I am a principal at Astrape Consulting.
And did you prepare or cause to be prepared under your direction 13 pages of direct testimony that's been pre-filed in the docket of this proceeding?
Yes.
Do you have any changes or additions to that testimony?
No.
Chair Belser, at this time I would move Mr. Wintermantle's pre-filed direct testimony into the record of this proceeding.
Mr. Wintermantle's pre-filed direct testimony will be entered into the record as if given from the stand.
Mr. Wintermantle, are there any exhibits to your testimony?
Yes, I had one exhibit, Exhibit RNW-1, That is the DESC 2023 Planning Reserve Margin Study that Astrape recently conducted on behalf of the company and was filed as part of the 2023 IRP.
You have any changes or additions to that exhibit?
No.
Chair Belcher, at this time I would move Exhibit RNW1 into the record of this proceeding.
I assume that the document that accompanied his pre-file testimony is RNW1.
It is.
It
yes,
was
ma'am.
just not marked as such.
Correct. We've handed up marked copies to the court reporter
Okay.
so that the
Thank you.
record shows that to be
The
right document.
exhibit called RNW1, which is the DESC 2023 Planning Reserve Margin Study, will be marked for identification as hearing exhibit number 6 and received into the evidence of this case.
Mr. Wintermantle, have you prepared a summary of your direct testimony?
Yes, I have.
Would you please deliver that to the commission and to the parties?
Yes. Good morning, Chair Belzer and members of the commission. My testimony introduces and summarizes the DESC 2023 Planning Reserve Margin Study that Astrape recently conducted on behalf of the company to assess the planning reserve margin necessary for the DESC system to meet its loss of load expectation criteria, also known as LOLE. The LOLE of a system represents the expected number of days in a year when the utility will not have enough resources to meet its load. The company uses a 1-day and 10-year reliability standard in its generation planning, which is met when the utility has enough capacity installed that firm load shed is expected to occur only 1 day in 10 years. This is an accepted industry standard. The 1-day and 10-year LOLE standard equates to 0.1 days per year. We evaluated the planning reserve margin, or PRM, which is needed to meet this standard, and expressed it as the installed capacity above the forecasted peak demand, expressed as a percentage of peak demand. In DESC's case, the planning reserve margin required to meet the 0.1 LOLE standard is 20.1%. To compute the required PRM for DESC, Astrape used its Servam planning model to perform tens of thousands of hourly simulations of DESC system at various reserve margin levels. Each of the yearly simulations was developed through a combination of deterministic and stochastic modeling of the uncertainty of weather, economic growth, unit performance, and assistance from neighboring utilities. We simulated a combination of 42 weather years with 5 economic load forecast error multipliers and 80 unit outage draws for each load scenario, resulting in 16,800 hourly simulations at each reserve margin level simulated. Each of the results from these hourly simulations was weighted based on their probability of occurrence. This produced a weighted average LOLE for each potential reserve margin, which ultimately showed that the planning reserve margin required to meet the 0.1 LOLE standard was a winter reserve margin of 20.1%. A winter reserve margin lower than that would result in a higher LOLE than target, which would result in higher probability of customer outages, and a higher reserve margin would result in an LOLE that is less than that target. Loads and resources for DESC and its surrounding first-tier balancing areas, including Duke Energy Progress, Duke Energy Carolinas, Santee Cooper, and the Southern Company, were all modeled in the study. 42 unique weather years were modeled for DESC and its neighbors. Servam captures the historical weather diversity and generator outage diversity in neighboring balancing areas across the simulations using Monte Carlo draws, and allowed utilities to share capacity based on economics, generator availability, and transmission constraints. Astrape conducted a low and high cold weather load response sensitivity to assess the impact of the study's cold weather load response assumptions on the planning reserve margin. In the low cold weather response sensitivity, DESC's peak loads were capped at the highest load seen in the last 5 years. This sensitivity shows that even with load response limited in this way, a 16.2% reserve margin is required. This sensitivity represents a limitation on load response because it's not likely that loads will saturate at the lowest temperature seen in just the last 5 years. On the other end of the spectrum, Astrape conducted a high cold weather load response sensitivity that assumes an increased load response in times of extreme cold weather, similar to the 30% peak load variance ERCOT experienced in February of 2021 during Winter Storm Uri, compared to their weather normal forecast. This sensitivity shows that if DESC's load response was in line with what ERCOT saw in 2021, a planning reserve margin of 22.2% would be required to meet the 1-day and 10-year standard. As the penetration of energy-limited resources of solar and battery storage continues to increase on the DESC system, it is important for planners to accurately understand their reliability contributions, especially during critical hours when capacity resources are needed the most. For this reason, Astrape was asked by DESC to compute the effective load carrying capacity, or ELCC, for storage and battery resources on DESC's system. In order to ensure solar and battery storage resources were compared equitably with new thermal resources, the load carrying capability for the solar and storage ELCC calculations were measured, assuming the load added was not perfect and assumed a 4% outage rate to account for the expected outage rate of a new thermal resource. As a result, differences in assumed ELCC between these resource classes are primarily due to intermittency of solar and energy limitations for battery storage, compared to the absence of intermittency or energy limitations for most thermal dispatchable units. This table from page 10 of my direct testimony summarizes the average winter ELCC values by incremental megawatt tranche. Because the critical hours are during winter mornings before or just after sunrise, the ELCC value of solar resources is limited. The table shows all the values are less than 3%. Astrape also computed the average and marginal winter ELCC values for 4-hour incremental energy storage tranches, assuming 2 potential different modes of operation. This table from page 11 of my direct testimony shows the results. The average ELCC in the table refers to the ELCC of the entire tranche of battery storage, while the marginal ELCC refers to the value of the next megawatt of storage. For example, 800 megawatts of storage, assuming the economic arbitrage operation, has an average ELCC of 86%, but the next megawatt, the 801st megawatt, has a value of 80%. The conservative operations on extreme days column assumes that DESC would have full control of the operation of the storage resources and thus could primarily conserve the storage energy. In other words, keep the battery charged and on standby and dispatch it only to address reliability issues on extreme days. The assumes economic arbitrage analysis assumes that DESC would not have full control of the operation of the storage resources and that the storage resource would be primarily dispatched to take advantage of energy arbitrage. In other words, the ability to buy and store energy when it is cheap and return it to the grid when it is expensive. The assumes economic arbitrage analysis results in a lower ELCC because there are times when unexpected forced outages occur on the system after the storage resources have been depleted to take advantage of energy arbitrage. The conclusions of the study are that allowing DESC's winter reserve margin to drop below 20.1% is likely to result in reliability levels lower than DESC's 1-day and 10-year standard. A summer reserve margin requirement of 15% is sufficient so that if a 20.1 winter reserve margin is maintained and the situation is monitored, it is likely that this 15% requirement will be met automatically. Regarding winter ELCCs, initial tranches of battery storage have a relatively high ELCC, but decline as penetrations increase. And due to timing of resource adequacy risks occurring on cold winter mornings, solar resources have low ELCC values. This concludes my summary of my direct testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Wintermantle. Have you prepared or caused to be prepared under your direction 10 pages of rebuttal testimony that has been pre-filed in the docket of this proceeding?
Yes.
Do you have any exhibits to that testimony?
No.
Do you have any changes or additions to the pre-filed testimony?
No.
If I were to ask you the questions contained in your pre-filed rebuttal testimony, would your answers from the stand today be the same?
Yes.
Chair Belzer, at this time, I would move into the record the pre-filed rebuttal testimony of Mr. Wintermantle.
Mr. Wintermantle's pre-filed rebuttal testimony will be received into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Mr. Wintermantle, have you prepared a summary of that pre-filed rebuttal testimony?
Yes.
Would you please deliver that to the commission and to the parties?
The purpose of my rebuttal testimony is to respond to the testimony from ORS witness Phil Hyatt of J. Kennedy and Associates Incorporated and CCL SACE and Sierra Club witness Derek Stinklick regarding the DESC 2023 Planning Reserve Martin Study. ORS witness Hyatt recommends that in future resource adequacy studies, DESC should fully document the extreme winter weather statistical analysis and demonstrate that the models reasonably reflect winter loads during extreme low temperatures in future IRPs, and report these findings in the stakeholder working group. Company witness Best testified that the company is willing to do so, but I have to point out that any implication that this has not been done in the present study would be misplaced. The variance in load due to weather versus the load forecast was modeled in the DESC 2023 Planning Reserve Margin Study and presented to stakeholders in December of 2022. As part of the study, Astrape conducted bookend sensitivities to evaluate both extreme low and extreme high customer load response sensitivities to extreme winter weather. Witness Stinklick has 4 critiques of the study. First, witness Stinklick takes issue with the solar and storage penetration levels evaluated in the ELCC portion of the DESC 2023 Planning Reserve Margin Study. The study analyzed up to 2,935 megawatts of solar capacity and incremental 900 megawatts of battery storage capacity. The 900 megawatts of battery storage is in addition to the 576 megawatts of existing pump storage on the system today. Cumulatively, Astrape analyzed 1,476 megawatts of storage on a 5,000 megawatt system, which represents a penetration of storage as a percent of system peak of approximately 30%. I believe the penetration analyzed for this study provides sufficient information for critical resource decisions over the next 5 to 10 years, and also provides a basis for the long-term periods, which will have the benefit of seeing future IRP updates before any of those decisions are made. Regarding solar penetration, the winter ELCC of solar will continue to be low, less than 1/2 of 1% for the 1,600 megawatt incremental block. So I do not believe simulating substantially higher solar penetrations above 3,000 megawatts would add significant value, but it could be analyzed in the future with higher battery storage tranches if it becomes meaningful to do so. Second, witness Stinklick takes issue with the fact that the study didn't discuss solar capacity factor adjustments in detail. As stated in the study report, the solar capacity factors modeled in CERVM for the 2026 study year across the 1,336 megawatt solar fleet range from 20% to 26%. Witness Neely discusses these capacity factors in more detail, and they are based on DESC's actual operating experience. Given the low winter ELCC of solar, I do not expect that any further capacity factor adjustments would have any meaningful impact on the study results. Third, witness Stinklick states that solar and storage resources were not treated fairly versus new gas options from a capacity accreditation perspective, because no ELCC for gas units was included. But this misses the point. As discussed in my direct testimony, the solar and storage resources weren't compared against perfect load, but load that reflected a 4% outage rate, which represents the equivalent forced outage rate for a new gas resource, and ensures that the solar and storage resource ELCC values are evaluated on par with a new thermal resource. The ELCC for solar and battery principally represent intermittency and energy limitations, which new thermal resources are not subject to. Regarding weather-related and fuel supply outages during cold weather periods, witness Walker discusses the reliability of these new gas resources and the expected behavior during cold snaps and the ability to secure fuel during these cold weather periods, which is why no additional accreditation penalty was warranted. If anything, the analysis provides new energy storage resources with a conservatively low forced outage rate of 3%, which is lower than new gas resources assume. Initial analysis performed by the consulting firm E3 on California storage resources shows that forced outage rates have been between 8 and 12%. And the 3% assumption for battery storage may need to be adjusted as part of the next IRP. Fourth, witness Stinklick states that most of the weather events that drive the LOLE calculations occurred in the cold winter periods in the early 1980s and worries that DESC is being overly conservative in its winter peaks. Witness Stinklick also thinks there is potential for double counting of winter risk, but did not have any recommendation. It is typical for a LOLE study to show load shed in only a few extreme weather years, as is the case in this study. It is precisely extreme and rare events like Winter Storm Uri and Winter Storm Elliott that drive planning reserve margin analysis, and that utilities must account for in their planning. This chart on page 8 of my rebuttal testimony shows the variance in load due to winter weather around the normal weather peak for the 42 years model. On the secondary axis, the minimum temperature of each year is displayed, and that's the line on the chart. It is no surprise that the early 1980s drive the study, as record low temperatures were seen during that period. It is also expected that the highest load response would be seen in these years. There is no reason to omit these occurrences from the study, and recent events seen nationally and locally, such as Winter Storm Uri and Winter Storm Elliott, show that extreme winter events will still occur. As I responded to witness Hyatt, the load response during these extreme cold temperatures should continue to be reviewed as part of future planning reserve margin studies and as more data is available. The load response in the study is based on recent historical data and was presented to stakeholders in December of 2022. In response to the potential double counting, because these 42 synthetic shapes used in the study were scaled such that the average peaks of the last 30 years would equal the weather normal forecast, the reserve margin percentage calculated in the study is essentially indifferent to the magnitude of the peak load forecast. The reserve margin percentage represents only the additional reserves needed to cover uncertainty of weather, economic load forecast error, and unit performance uncertainty on the system above the normal weather load forecast, and therefore there is no double counting. Likewise, I disagree with witness Stinklick that new solar and storage resources were not treated equally with new gas resources for the reasons stated in my direct and rebuttal testimony. This concludes the summary of my rebuttal testimony.
Chair Belser, Mr. Neely and Mr. Wintermantel are available for questions, cross-examination from the parties, and questions from the commission.
Thank you, Mr. Ziegler. Before we start cross-examination, let's take a 15-minute break and give everybody a chance to stretch their legs and move about a little bit. We will return at 11:32, 11:35. Good morning, and we are back with the Public Service Commission and the continuation of the hearing in docket number 2023-9-E, Dominion Energy's 2023 Integrated Resource Plan. Let's take a roll call of commissioners, or, well, all commissioners are present, all 7. 1 virtually, 6 in the hearing room. And we are on cross-examination of this panel and recognize Sierra Club.
Thank you. Good morning, commissioners. Good morning, panel. My name is Isabella Ariza, and I represent the Sierra Club in this proceeding. Mr. Neely, I'll start with you. On page 36, lines 3 and 4 of your direct, you state that you didn't put an annual constraint on the amount of batteries that the model could choose. Is that correct?
Where are you, please?
Page 36, lines 3 and 4 of your direct.
That's correct. There was no annual constraint on the battery resources.
However, isn't it true that you did constrain the timing of when the model could choose to build batteries?
Batteries were available after 2028.
So you did constrain the timing of when the model could choose them?
Yes.
So technically the model could not choose to build batteries whenever it was economical to do so?
It could build economically chosen batteries after 2028.
Okay. Didn't this effectively prevent the model from building the necessary firm capacity to replace Williams by 2031 with batteries?
No.
Why not?
Because Williams doesn't retire until 2031.
Had you permitted the model to select more batteries instead of constraining the timing up to 2028, is it possible that I would have selected enough batteries to replace Williams?
We didn't model that.
Okay. Turning to your rebuttal, on page 6, lines 9 through 12, you state that when Plexos created each of the build plans, it was free to choose non-fossil resources whenever they were shown to be capable of optimally filling customers' needs, correct?
That's correct.
Isn't it true that you limited the Plexos model to select only up to 300 megawatts of solar per year?
That's correct.
So in other words, Dominion artificially capped solar at 300 megawatts per year.
It's not an artificial cap, it's an appropriate cap, but we did cap solar at 300 megawatts a year.
Okay, and I'll ask you about the reasonableness of that cap in a second. But isn't it true that in the reference build plan, the Plexos model selected the maximum allowable solar capacity every year from 2028 to 2036?
Subject to check, I'll agree with that.
Okay, and isn't it reasonable to assume that the model would build additional solar in each of those years if it was not constrained to 300 megawatts?
No, in fact, what it would tend to do is not build anything until the lowest cost point in the curve. So,
you admitted, though, that in the reference build plan, the model selected the maximum allowable solar capacity every year from 28 to 36.
That's right, but it wouldn't have necessarily picked any more than that if there was no annual constraint.
Okay. During your summary and just now, you stated that the 300 megawatt limit is reasonable. And on page 36, lines 2 of your direct, you state that this was based on historical build rates. Is that correct?
Yes.
At the same time, throughout your testimony, you acknowledged that the IRA created significant incentives to renewable energy. Is that also correct?
Yes, that's correct. And the reference build plan builds 5,025 megawatts of solar, 1,600 megawatts of battery resources.
Wouldn't you agree that due to the passage of the IRA 1 year ago, basing a solar build limit on historical pace is no longer representative?
No, I think what we did was completely appropriate and is consistent with other utilities in the Southeast.
But wouldn't you agree that at least a significant element has changed between your historical build rate and now because the tax credits available under the IRA were not available historically.
Oh, I didn't understand what you were getting at, but no, I think the bill limit is still appropriate even with the IRA.
So are you willing to leave money on the table associated with solar build out just because historically you have only built around 300 megawatts per year?
300 megawatts is 6% of our peak load. That's an appropriate level of annual build.
Will Dominion forever allow only 300 megawatts of solar because it's all it has done historically?
We'll evaluate that limit in the next IRP.
Isn't the IRA the incentive you needed to push to do better and save customers money?
We built 5,025 megawatts of solar in our reference case. That's a significant amount of solar on a system that's only 5,000 megawatts peak, on top of 1,000 megawatts we already have online and operating.
Here and in your testimony, you bring up the size of Dominion as one of the reasons why you limited solar build out. But the size of the utility doesn't really determine the amount of solar it can bring online, correct?
Of course it does. If your peak is only 5,000 megawatts, then 10,000 megawatts of solar doesn't make a bit of sense.
But none of those limitations are technical limitations or physical constraints on the system, are they?
I'm sorry, I'm not following you. What you're asking?
You attach the limit to the solar build out to the size of the utility. I am asking you that limit is not based on technical limitations of your system.
Right. It's based on a reasonable plan. It's built in a reasonable plan with a reasonable amount of solar being added each year.
But in other words, your system could handle higher amounts of solar.
It could, but for resource planning, that wouldn't be an appropriate assumption.
Okay. You've mentioned in your summary and in your rebuttal testimony, page 10, lines 7 through 9, that it would be unreasonable to assume, as witness Stenslick suggests, that battery and solar resources can be added in quantities that exceed historical and regionally accepted limits. And that's what we've been discussing just now, correct?
That's right.
Regarding what you call regionally accepted limits, who sets those?
Each utility sets its own limit.
So it's more like a historical trend and not a binding limit set in stone.
It's just a way to build appropriate resource plans using the resource planning process.
Okay, let me turn to page 12 of your rebuttal testimony. Do you see the map that you showed during your summary as well?
Yes, I do.
On lines 10 to 11, you state that given the limited area within Dominion's territory that qualifies as energy communities, it's unreasonable to assume that more than a limited fraction of the solar and battery resources will be able to access the energy community bonus. Is that correct?
That's correct.
First off, here you recognize that at least a fraction of the solar and battery resources will be able to access the energy community bonus. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yet you didn't consider it at all in your modeling. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Isn't it true that you plan to build the watery battery replacement at the watery site?
That's one of the options for replacing watery, with the decision has not been made.
Okay, if that decision is made and you build the watery battery at the watery site, wouldn't that automatically make those 400 megawatts eligible for the energy community bonus discount?
Yes.
In any case, I want to ask you, Mr. Neely, isn't it true that to receive the IRA energy community bonus, the battery resources don't need to be actually located in Dominion service territory?
That's correct.
On page 13, starting on line 2 of your rebuttal, you say that the energy community area is too small and that to include it as an assumption would unreasonably bias the analysis. Is that correct?
Yes.
Is 1 to 2 million acres a small area, in your opinion?
Well, if I owned 1 to 2 million acres, it wouldn't be a small area, but when you compare that to the state of South Carolina, it is a small area.
Okay, so compared to the state of South Carolina, we agree that 1 to 2 acres is a small area. But isn't it true that 250 acres is more than enough area to build 2,000 megawatts of battery storage?
250 acres, 2,000 megawatts of battery storage. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. It's about a megawatt per container, but I'm not sure how many containers you can fit on an acre.
Subject to check, would you agree with that statement?
250 acres, 2,000 megawatts of battery. Yeah, that doesn't sound reasonable to me.
Doesn't sound reasonable or unreasonable?
It doesn't sound reasonable.
Do you have a ballpark area in your mind that you would need to build 2,000 megawatts of battery storage?
No.
Okay. Would you agree that it's reasonable to pursue opportunities to build storage in locations that would give you a 10% discount and save ratepayers money?
Yes, I mean, if the area is available, if that resource can be put anywhere, and that additional 10% could be a benefit, but it may be that locating that resource near a transmission line or something else may have a higher benefit. So it's not an automatic assumption that you should put it in those energy community areas.
But you
Mr.
do
Neely,
agree that...
Just a moment, please. Thank you for moving your microphone.
I got to see how to get this where
There
I
you
can
go.
look at her and use it.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we're good now.
Thank you. So would you agree that it's more prudent to pursue opportunities that will make a resource cheaper rather than paying full price with regards to batteries?
That's one consideration for sure.
Okay, turning now to heat rates. On page 14 of your rebuttal, in the Q&A that starts on line 14, you state that the heat rate issue is insignificant. Is that correct?
Well, I think I'm not sure if I used the word insignificant. I think I said that it wouldn't change the resource plans.
Could you read lines 14 through 17 of page 14 of your rebuttal, please?
Do you agree with Witness Stenklick that the heat rate issue is significant and the heat rates used are much lower than the correct ones?
And your answer is no?
Yes, I say that it's not significant.
Okay. Isn't it true that the heat rates are a crucial assumption in analyzing the total levelized cost of CCs and CTs in your portfolio?
The heat rate issue only applies to new resources. Most of the fuel being consumed is by the existing resources, so it's only a small difference to the levelized net present value calculation.
I apologize. I should have asked, isn't it true that the heat rates are a crucial assumption in analyzing the total levelized cost of new CCs and CTs to your portfolio?
Well, the levelized cost includes all the cost. So it is a component, and we agreed that we made a mistake there and that we will fix that. So, but all of our plans build significant amount of new gas resources, so all the plans are affected by this issue, and so the relationship to the plans probably would not change, and so the selection of the reference plan would still be our preferred plan.
Okay, Mr. Neely, would you agree with me that fuel costs can make up easily 1/3 to 1/2 of the total cost of the shared resource over its lifetime?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what my calculation is like 5% of the cost or fuel cost.
Okay. The shared resource is expected to run frequently. Is that correct?
Yes.
It will have a 70 to 80% capacity factor.
How much?
70 to 80%?
That seems a little bit high, but in the ballpark.
Okay. So the more the shared resource runs, the more fuel it uses. And so a change in the heat rate for a plant that runs almost all the time would have a meaningful impact on the cost to run it. Is that correct?
It would definitely increase the cost of fuel to run it. And the other thing is, if the fuel cost increase, it changes the actual dispatch. So you may end up with the same fuel cost with and without the heat rate change. It's just that in one case, you're running the unit more at a lower fuel cost and less at a higher fuel cost. So it may not change the total fuel cost at all.
How did you develop your heat rate assumptions? Where did you get that information from?
Those were provided to us by Dominion Energy Construction Department.
And where did you get the assumptions for other resources other than the CC and the CT?
For renewable resources, we use NREL.
Is that a publicly available resource?
Yes, it is.
On page 15, lines 4 and 5 of your testimony is where you admit the heat rate error and explain that it led to a 0.56% increase in the LMPV of the reference case. Is that correct?
That's correct.
But again, you didn't believe that percentage to be significant. Is that correct?
Well, all of the resource plans would be changed by about the same amount.
In your opinion, what would be a significant percentage in price difference?
Something in excess of 5% would be significant for sure.
Okay. If a 0.56% difference means you're spending $19.6 million more per year, don't you think ratepayers will think that that percentage is in fact significant?
Well, this heat rate doesn't determine what the ratepayers will pay in fuel costs. They'll pay actual fuel costs. This is just for modeling purposes, determining a resource plan.
Sorry to interrupt. Mr. Neely, if fuel costs were to increase, would the heat rate error have larger impacts on the results?
If the heat rate increase was more than 11%, then the impact would be more than 0.56%, yes.
And on this same page, page 15, lines 1 and 2, you state that the only variable heat rate affects is fuel, and that fuel is only one component of the total cost of a new gas unit. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you mentioned this before, that ratepayers will only pay what fuel costs are at that point. Is that correct?
Ratepayers pay for the actual fuel costs, yes.
And they pay for 100% of the fuel costs.
That's correct.
Mr. Neely, can you confirm whether Dominion is evaluating building any combined cycle other than the shared resource with Santee Cooper?
That's not the only combined cycle that was modeled. So there are other combined cycles in the integrated resource plan. Are we pursuing another resource at this time? No, that's the only one we're pursuing at this time.
Okay. Switching to page 21, lines 3 and 4 of your rebuttal, you state that the company must prepare for higher load growth from electrification and the rapid adoption of EVs. Is that correct?
Yes.
To be clear, you're aware that Mr. Stenslick's testimony did not take issue with your EV load projections, correct?
Correct.
And to clarify, the expected rapid adoption of electric vehicles does not necessarily entail peak load growth if you adequately plan for it. Is that correct?
Well, the forecast did have quite a bit of peak load growth from EVs.
However, you are evaluating, I think it's Guidehouse who's evaluating a study that would implement time of use rates meant to reduce the impact of EV charging on peak demand.
That's correct.
Could you confirm whether you're projecting a significant load from EV manufacturing in South Carolina?
Yes, we are.
Do you know how much that would be?
It's not in our load forecast that we used for this IRP, but in the next load forecast that we'll use for the 2024 IRP, we expect about 150 megawatts of additional load from EV manufacturing.
Okay. And one final question, Mr. Neely. You said during your summary and in your rebuttal testimony that Mr. Stenslick used unreasonable pricing for battery. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
But Mr. Stenslick used your same battery pricing assumptions in his modeling. Are you aware of that?
With an additional 10% for the energy community benefit.
But the pricing assumptions were the same.
Not after you add the 10% reduction for an energy community benefit.
Okay. Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Ariza. SACE, CCL.
Just give me 1 second to get my papers together here. Oh, yeah. Okay, good morning, Mr. Wintermantel, Mr. Neely. Kate Mixon on behalf of SACE and CCL. Mr. Wintermantel, I'm going to start with you. You've worked at Astrape Consulting since 2009, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And your role is largely working with utilities to conduct resource adequacy and ELCC studies, is that right?
Yeah, we've done work for utilities, RTOs, state commissions, so not solely utilities.
Astrape is the exclusive licensor of the Strategic Energy and Risk Valuation Model, or SERVM. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you talked about this some in your summary and in your testimony, but generally, SERVM's a reliability planning and production cost model. Is that right?
Yes, it's reliability is a broad term. SERVM is focused on, I would say, the resource adequacy portion of reliability, if you think about reliability in a broader sense.
And that is the modeling tool that you relied on for the resource adequacy and ELCC, or modeling tool you rely on generally for the resource adequacy and ELCC studies that you conduct in your role at Astrape.
That's correct.
And please feel free to correct me on this, but would you agree generally that the purpose of SERVM is to test electric systems against thousands of kind of iterations of possible future conditions by looking at historical conditions, forecasted conditions, in order to try and evaluate the associated uncertainties with those conditions, to evaluate the likelihood, magnitude, and cost of future reliability events.
Yes, SERVM is used for, and especially in this case, for resource adequacy metrics, which were loss of load expectation. We do look at a broad number of historical weather periods, a lot of unit outage draws, so we get a full distribution of what can occur in the future. It was not used for cost. I think you mentioned cost. It was used for loss of load expectation only to determine a planning reserve margin and the ELCC values that go into Mr. Neely's Plexos model.
Generally, so you'd agree SERVM's a pretty sophisticated software, right?
I would consider it sophisticated, in line with the other models that are in the industry, Plexos, Encompass, a lot of the planning models at the same sophistication level.
Right. And as you testified, Servum can be used to determine what a utility's reserve margin should be to ensure that its system meets certain reliability metrics.
That's correct.
And are you also aware that utilities can use Servum to validate the reliability of portfolios that result from capacity expansion modeling?
Sure, a distinct portfolio can be modeled in Servum, and the loss of load expectation can be an output of those simulations.
Right. And so the purpose of the PRM and ELCC study that you conducted for this IRP was to determine what reserve margin Dominion needed to maintain that LOLE of 0.1 days per year, or 1 day every 10 years. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And LOLE is intended to represent the number of days a utility system would be expected to not have enough resources to meet its load. Is that right?
That's correct. It's expectation, and it ties to the industry standard. We're going to build enough capacity to meet the 1 day and 10-year standard.
Right. The database for the Servum model that you used in the PRM study was a combination of Astrape data. I think you mentioned the Eastern Connection database that Astrape maintains, along with certain revisions for Dominion's system that they provided. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so the Dominion provided data included, information, for example, about profiles for different resources, including factors like minimum capacities, uptime, downtime, ramp rates, et cetera. Is that right?
That's correct. We generally, for the utility that we're modeling, we like to get their specific data to the extent it's available. I would say some of those variables that you mentioned aren't hugely extensive in driving the LOLE. More in the capacity max is kind of the max capacity of the resource, because we're looking at extreme periods are the critical variables. But yeah.
And just one more question for you. Would you say that Astrape works closely with licensees of the Servum software to make sure that the software is running properly, to answer questions about how the modeling software works, different settings, et cetera?
Yes, we certainly have customer service, and our licensees can ask questions, and we try to help them.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Wintermantel. Mr. Neely, your testimony presents the results of the Plexos modeling that Dominion conducted for this IRP, right?
That's correct.
And so you are responsible for incorporating the results of any outside studies that Dominion conducted for purposes of this IRP, such as the Guidehouse EV study and the DSM market potential study, into the modeling that Dominion conducted.
Not directly, but yes, indirectly.
Okay. And so have you reviewed those two studies that I mentioned in the accompanying testimony from Mr. Robinson and Mr. Durkee?
Yes.
The Guidehouse EV study, it assumes accelerated EV adoption in the future, in large part due to the incentives and rebates associated with the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA. Is that right?
That's Mr. Robinson's testimony, yeah.
Okay. And so here, I'm going to pull up a portion of that study here. And I think this is, I don't think I should need to zoom in for purposes of my question, but this is from page 42 of that EV study. You'd agree that those incentives include, for example, a potential $7,500 tax credit for certain EVs and consumers, some consumer and business tax credits for charging equipment, and various types of state funding.
I'm sorry, I'm not seeing where you're reading that, but if you're reading it from that piece of paper, I'll agree to it.
Well, you see in the second row where it provides IRA vehicle and infrastructure incentives. You see there that the first bullet point there is a $7,500 credit,
Yes.
right? And then you also see there are various rows at the bottom for types of IIJA funding.
Yes.
Okay. And so, are you aware in the EV study that Guidehouse actually updated its EV load forecast to account for its estimate of the impact that those federal incentives would have on EV adoption?
Yes.
And so the EV study included a forecast that was both pre-incentive and another that was post-incentive, and that accounted for those federal policies.
I'm not aware of the two forecasts.
Okay. Actually, I think I have a color copy here. And so this is from page 50 of the EV study. You can see there's a 2022 forecast and then the 2022 pre-incentive forecast, and that there's quite a large increase in forecasted EV sales. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And are you aware the result of that updated EV forecast was actually that it actually doubled? The result was that the updated EV forecast actually doubled relative to the pre-incentive forecast. Is that correct?
It looks about double. I haven't calculated it.
So this is from page 53 of the EV study. As you can see, it says forecasted EV load. Do you see at the top where it says this is a 2x growth relative to pre-incentive draft results?
Yes, I see that.
Thank you. Now, those increased adoption rates, those are estimates, right? Informed estimates, but still estimates.
It's a forecast.
Right. And so do you believe it's reasonable to assume that IRA incentives will increase adoption of EVs and that will impact Dominion's load in the future?
I believe that the Guidehouse study is appropriately capturing benefits.
Right. And it's important for Dominion to plan for outside factors that could affect its load, right?
Yes.
And so the result is that Dominion included that updated higher EV load forecast in its overall load forecast in this IRP, right?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Neely, are you aware that the IRA also includes tax credits, rebates, and incentives for energy efficiency improvements as well?
I'm not aware of that.
Okay, you're not aware that the IRA has consumer incentive.
I'm not very much involved in the DSM process. I use the results of the DSM forecast in the load forecast that we model, but I'm not integrally involved in the DSM study.
Okay. Well, I guess turning to the DSM potential study, Dominion treated DSM as a reduction to the load forecast in its IRP based on the results of that study, correct?
That's correct.
And so the three core market scenarios, they use the achievable potential identified in the DSM study. Is that right?
That's correct.
But the DSM potential study did not evaluate the potential impact that that the DSM-related rebates and incentives in the IRA could have on customer participation in DSM programs. Isn't that right?
I think that's a better question for Mr. Durkee or Ms. Shelton.
Well, Mr. Neely, this does have a direct impact on the load that Dominion modeled in its IRP, correct?
And we believe that their forecast is appropriate, and so we did use those reductions from DSM.
Okay. So I've put up here, this is from page 18 of the DSM potential study. If you could I'll give you a second to review the highlighted portion, and then we'll ask you to confirm something. And actually, I think I can speed this up a little bit. I'm just going to actually ask you to focus on the last sentence here.
Madam Chairman, the witness has said that these are questions for another witness. It's not his study. I'd respectfully request that the witness's statement be honored and that these questions be ruled out of order.
I agree, except to the extent that she's asking about inputs, and she can still refer them to that witness. But I don't know we're talking about.
Yeah, Chair Belzer, these questions are my question. This is one question leading up to another question about the load forecast in Dominion's IRP that Mr. Neely was responsible for.
Would you repeat the question?
So
you asked him to read the paragraph, and then you said you'd speed it up.
Yeah, and so let's look at just the last sentence here, which reads, while Dominion may be able to take certain aspects of the IRA into account in its IRP, such as the potential for increased uptake in EVs as a result of IRA incentives, it's not practicable or appropriate to make similar assumptions as to the influence of DSM programs on the uptake of the measures contemplated in this potential study. Do you read that as well?
I read that, yes.
Okay. And so you would agree then that the DSM potential study does not take into account any potential increase in DSM as a result of the rebates in the IRA?
That seems to be what it's saying to me.
Okay. Thank you. So the modeling that you conducted, that was a separate evaluation from the market potential study, correct?
Yes, the Plexus modeling is not not the DSM study.
Okay, and so Dominion could have taken the results of that potential study and made an adjustment, perhaps, to account for the expected increases in energy efficiency adoption from the IRA, couldn't it?
No, that would be inappropriate. That's why we hired Guidehouse to do, or to ICF to do the study, because we don't have the expertise in that area to do the study.
Okay, but you hired ICF to conduct the DSM potential study, correct?
That's right.
And they did not include the IRA impacts in the DSM potential study, right? Okay. The EFA requires Dominion provide a long-term forecast of the utility sales and peak demand under various reasonable scenarios, correct?
That's correct.
Dominion doesn't think that one of those reasonable scenarios would be the potential for additional energy efficiency savings resulting from the rebates and incentives in the IRA.
We hired ICF, to do the DSM potential study. We take their study and use those results. They're the experts on DSM.
Okay, so in other words, the IRA impacts on EE or DSM savings levels are not included in the modeling in this IRP. Is that correct?
That appears to be what is stated in the report.
Okay, so is Dominion saying that it's reasonable to estimate the impact that EV incentives will have to increase EV adoption and load, but it's not important to estimate the impact that DSM incentives would have on decreasing Dominion's load?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Neely. Those are all of my questions.
Thank you, Ms. Mixon. Sasiba? Mr. Burns?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Great. Mr. Neely, most of my questions will be directed at you. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
I would like to start with your Plexos modeling testimony on page 6 of your rebuttal. If you look at page 6, lines 9 to 10 of your rebuttal testimony. I assume you have that in front of you. Is that
I do,
right?
yes.
From lines 9 to 10, you say, when the Plexos optimization model created each of the build plans presented here, it was free to choose non-fossil resources whenever they were shown to be capable of optimally filling customers' needs, correct?
That's correct.
And it says when those needs could be met for energy, capacity, and reserves reliably and economically, correct?
Correct.
You also note in lines 12 through 15 that Plexos did in fact choose significant non-emitting resources, didn't it?
Yes, it did.
Okay. And the model chose those non-emitting resources like solar and storage because those resources, in your own words, were shown to be capable of optimally filling customers' needs for energy capacity and reserves reliably and economically, right?
That's correct.
The IRP, the proposed IRP adds, I think you testified, 5,025 megawatts of solar and 1,600 megawatts of battery over the planning horizon, correct?
That's correct. And in the
And
reference
adds solar
plan.
every year from 26 through 49. Correct?
Correct.
All right. Would you agree with me that Dominion's 2023 IRP would not be adding all of this new solar and storage if it could not be done cost effectively and reliably?
All right, you ask that question again?
Would you agree with me that Dominion's 2023 proposed IRP would not be adding all of this new solar and storage if it could not be done cost effectively and reliably?
I would agree with that, yes.
Okay. So when you go back to page 6, lines 9 to 10, and you say that the Plexos model was free to choose non-fossil resources, that's not exactly accurate, is it?
It was free to choose non-emitting resources.
If it could add more than 300 megawatts of solar per year economically, the Plexos model was restricted from adding above 300, correct?
It was restricted to adding just 300 per year.
Okay. So if the Plexos model would otherwise have added more than 300 megawatts under measures of economical and reliability, it was prevented from doing so because of your interconnection restraint.
It was prevented to doing that because we constrained the model to a reasonable level per year. That annual limit didn't change the total amount that it was able to add, which is the 5,025 megawatts of solar, 1,600 megawatts of battery resources.
If it could have added more earlier, then one must assume that it could have added more than 5,000 megawatts over the life of the IRP, correct?
That's just your assumption. We didn't model that one.
You didn't model that, correct?
That's correct.
There's another witness in this proceeding that did model what it would look like without that restriction on it. Did witness Stenklein?
Yes, he did.
Okay. The Plexos model also was limited in the amount of storage it was allowed to add before 2036. Is that right?
That's correct.
So the model was not actually free to select non-fossil resources above those limits and constraints that Dominion itself placed on those resources. Is that correct?
It was free to select those resources within those constraints.
I think you and I are saying the same thing. I want to make sure that the record is clear. It was not free to add more than those restraints during the years those restraints were placed on it, was it?
Correct.
Okay. If Dominion or DESC could cost effectively and reliably replace Williams and Wateree without adding new fossil generation to its system, that would reduce fuel cost risks for customers during that time frame, wouldn't it?
Well, it may reduce fuel cost risk, but it would increase other risk. That would be a very risky way to replace Williams because of the issues in the Charleston area. We need a dispatchable resource to meet the needs in that area. And so without that dispatchable resource, we would it'd be a very risky thing for our customers.
What do you mean by dispatchable resource?
Something such as a combined cycle or a CT gas unit.
Okay, so the test you put on what could be built to replace Williams is self-defined to result in the selection of a CC or a CT, correct?
That's what's needed for a reliable replacement of Williams, yes.
We'll take up, I suppose, with Mr. Stenklick, whether he agrees with you that that's the only thing that could reliably replace Williams. I believe there's testimony on the record in this case, is there not, that there are other resources that could perform that job. And you just disagree with that?
I disagree with that, yes.
Okay. Let's turn to the interconnection limit a little bit. You say that a 300, and I think you just testified that a 300 megawatt per year solar interconnection limit is the reasonable limitation, correct?
Yes, it is.
And the only rationale that I saw in your testimony for this limit is that other utilities also have annual interconnection limits, and that limit is consistent with previous rates of solar interconnection on Dominion's system. Is that right?
That's right. Those are the primary reasons we chose the 300 megawatts, but a limit is a reasonable way to plan the system.
Have you done any studies or evaluated any studies done by other utilities to establish an annual interconnection limit on solar?
We have evaluated what other utilities use for limits. Yes,
so you know that they use limits, but you haven't looked at the rationale behind those limits. Is that right?
I have not looked at the rationale behind their limits.
Okay. Has Dominion conducted a study that establishes a 300 megawatt limitation as what Dominion could reasonably undertake in a year?
The 300 limit is to produce a resource plan that's reasonable. That's what the limit is for. Yes, it is possible that more megawatts than 300 could be added in a year, but that wouldn't produce a reasonable resource plan if we allow the model to put much more megawatts than that in a single year.
If the model is looking at whether it can be economically and reliably done, and it chooses to add more than 300 megawatts, shouldn't you need to prove that you can't add more than 300 megawatts rather than restricting that model?
The 300 megawatts is a reasonable limit to put on a resource plan. We need a reasonable limit so that our plans that we produce from the model are reasonable.
Let's look at how we look at what reasonable is then. In years past, where Dominion has interconnected approximately 300 megawatts of solar on its system, how many individual projects were interconnected?
I don't have that number.
Wouldn't you agree that the number of projects being interconnected in a given year is an important consideration?
Yes.
Okay.
It all depends on the size of the.
Say that again. Sorry.
Depends on the size of the project. You know, it would be for 75 megawatt projects. It would be 4 projects.
But if it was looking at 100 megawatt projects, it would only be 3 projects, right?
That's right.
So it may actually be more challenging to interconnect more smaller projects than it would be to connect relatively fewer large projects. Is that right?
It would certainly take a lot more interconnection studies to connect a lot more smaller projects. The 300 megawatt per year produces a reasonable level of solar additions.
In years past, especially prior to the enactment of Act 62 in 2019, Dominion was seeing a significant number of small projects interconnect on an annual basis, wasn't it?
I don't have that list in front of me.
Okay. But if you're interconnecting a smaller number of large projects, you'll have fewer line taps, fewer coordinated outages, and fewer interconnection facilities per project, won't you? Or per megawatt?
Yes, per megawatt.
So is it fair then to say that megawatts is not a reliable proxy for an annual interconnection limit?
No, I think the 300 megawatts produces reasonable plans for the resource planning process. It doesn't mean that if we went out for an RFP and we got 400 megawatts, we would reject 100 megawatts. No. But for a resource planning process, using 300 megawatts per year is a reasonable assumption.
I realize that you keep saying that, but when you get down to what reasonable means here, we've already established that a megawatt is not a reliable proxy for an annual interconnection limit. It doesn't speak to the amount of interconnection. It doesn't speak to the coordinated outages, and it doesn't speak to the number of line taps. What does it speak to restrict megawatts if you're not looking at these other issues?
It speaks to how many megawatts would be added in a year. It speaks to what the total number of megawatts are added over the planning horizon. It's a reasonable way to model the system and keep the resource plans reasonable, useful. The process is useful because of that limit.
All right, let's try a different tack. Let's assume that Dominion is only going to bring online the exact amount of solar that the company currently has in its preferred resource plan. I'm not asking about more solar than that 5,000 some megawatts, okay?
Okay.
The effect of a 500 megawatt cap versus a 300 megawatt cap would mean that the model could add solar more quickly to the Dominion system, correct?
That is a potential option. Doesn't mean that the model would. It might add 500 megawatts every other year.
All right, if it did add solar more quickly, it would be doing that because, according to what you've defined earlier in your testimony, that solar was shown to be capable of optimally fulfilling customers' needs for energy capacity and reserves reliably and economically, correct?
Correct.
All right. The commission has jurisdiction over state interconnection, doesn't it?
I'm not familiar with that.
Okay. The Energy Freedom Act in 2019, Act 62, that statute was amended to explicitly ensure reasonable interconnection timelines. Are you aware of that?
I'm not familiar with that.
Well, let's bear with me. I'm going to direct your attention, and I will pull this up so you can take a look at it because you probably won't have it in front of you. So bear with me. Let me share. I want to make sure I'm sharing the right. I am showing you section 58-27-460, sub D. I don't know if y'all can read that or not, so let me see if I can zoom in. Can you see that?
No. I'm sorry.
Working on it.
The screen is so far away from me that there's no way I could ever.
Understood, and I'm sorry for that. I'm doing my best from this end. But let me look at this. This is sub D of 58-27-460, and it states, the commission shall establish reasonable guidelines to ensure reasonable interconnection timelines, including time requirements to deliver a final system impact study to all interconnection customers that execute a system impact study agreement prior to 3 months after the effective date of this act. The commission shall consider implementation of additional performance incentives and enforcement mechanisms for electrical utilities to ensure compliance with this requirement. Did I read, to the best of your knowledge, did I read that correctly, given that you may not be able to see that?
Yeah, I think you did.
Okay. I'm going to stop sharing because it gets confusing. So if the commission determined that Dominion's pace of interconnection needed to be increased to facilitate the most reasonable and prudent resource plan, it could do something about it, couldn't it?
It could. But I think that what you're reading has to do with actual interconnection projects and how they are processed through the system. It's not specifically, to my knowledge, related to how you would create a resource plan for an IRP.
Wouldn't part of determining what a reasonable interconnection limit be, let me strike that, let me rephrase. Wouldn't it be part of determining what a reasonable interconnection limit to consider what the commission and what the South Carolina law allows?
If there was a limit provided by the commission, yeah, that would certainly be a factor.
If your limit is actually more restrictive than what the law and public policy would allow in South Carolina, then it wouldn't, by definition, be a reasonable one, would it?
It could still be a reasonable limit for the planning process.
Let's talk about storage then. It's not just interconnection limits that you included in your modeling. There was also a limitation on the amount of storage available to the model at the point in time when Williams would need to be replaced. Isn't that right?
Yes.
According to witness Stenklick's testimony, the model could not select more than 800 megawatts of storage prior to 2036. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
So as a consequence of the interconnection limits that you've assumed and the limited storage capacity available to the Plexus model prior to 2036, your model was forced to choose natural gas as a primary replacement resource for Williams. Is that fair to say?
The selection of battery as a replacement for Williams would not be reasonable. The Williams resource has to operate many times for days continuously in order to maintain the transmission system. There are no battery resources that we're modeling that can operate for days and generate for days. So the most reasonable, reliable way to replace Williams is not with the battery and solar. It requires a dispatchable resource that can run days, even weeks, while transmission is being maintained.
Witness Stenklick and Witness Hotelling have done or evaluated an alternative solution for replacing Williams that does not rely on a new CC. Is that right?
That's correct.
And in fact, Witness Hotelling actually modeled Witness Stenklick's proposed portfolio in the Servim to test its reliability based on the Estrape reliability study. Are you aware of that?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Did Dominion evaluate through the Servim this potential alternative?
The reserve margin study that was done for us by Estrape determined that if plans were built with a 20.1% reserve margin, that they would meet the loss of load metric. And so all of the plans, the ones that Witness Stenklick created, the ones that we created, all built to meet a 20.1 winter reserve margin study. So it's very reasonable to assume that all those plans would also meet the loss of load expected metric.
And so if Witness Stenklick and Witness Hotelling show that they modeled Witness Stenklick's alternative portfolio through the Servim to test its reliability and it met those standards, you wouldn't know whether that was accurate or not because Dominion did not do that test.
It wasn't necessary to do that test because all of our plans were built to meet the 20.1 reserve margin study. And that loss of load is a very good and appropriate metric, but it doesn't recognize issues such as the one around Charleston and the Williams unit. Removing the Williams unit from the system creates other issues that can't be resolved by solar and storage.
Thank you. I understand your testimony. But there's another element of the work that you did is the 50-50 ownership of solar. 50% would be IPP and 50% would be owned by the utility. Is that right?
That was the limit. Yeah, that's not how much was added to in the plan, but yeah, that was the annual limit.
Okay. Dominion can provide locational guidance to potential IPP providers during procurements, correct?
I would assume that we could.
Okay. And shouldn't cost drive the decision of whether a given amount of solar is going to be procured through IPP or self-built?
That's definitely a significant component. It's not the only component.
What areas of it would be, well, strike that question, but you testified to numerous benefits, as you put it, or requirements that utility self-built solar met and provided to the system. I think locational and control and things like that. Is that right?
That's
I'm
correct.
not citing to the exact paragraph, but say that again.
Yeah, you're correct.
Okay. Isn't it true that when Dominion or DESC contracts with an independent power producer, it can request operational control of the IPP's solar facility?
It depends on what mechanism's used. If it's just an RFP, yeah, we can set lots of constraints for an RFP. If it's been put to us through a PURPA project, we lose some of those opportunities to constrain that.
Well, if you did have such control, it would give Dominion direct ability to control the generation coming from those facilities, right? Just like a facility owned by Dominion.
Yes.
All right. Wouldn't the CPRE stakeholder process be an appropriate place to discuss and propose any prescriptive ownership split?
I'm not familiar with that process.
Your model applies a 50-50 ownership split and therefore assumes that split when it's costing solar resources, doesn't it?
It is, yes, it assumes the 50-50 split as an annual limit, yeah.
Okay, so if that 50-50 split were adjusted such that IPPs could apply and provide more of that power, if they could do so more economically, then it's reasonable to assume that the model would bring online more solar faster because it would be more economical, correct?
It is reasonable to assume that there is a possibility. You're speaking of a hypothetical that we didn't model. It's also possible that it would choose something completely different, such as waiting till 2036 to bring any solar on the system if we took away the constraint.
You say, I think in your testimony, that a minimum amount of utility ownership is necessary. Do you
Yes.
consider 50% to be a minimum amount?
50% is more than a minimum amount, but you also need to recognize that in the reference plan, twice as much PPA solar is built as utility-owned solar.
On page 11 of your rebuttal testimony, could you turn there, please?
Yes.
Are you there?
Yes.
That's where you testify, at the top of the page, you testify about the benefits that self-build provides. And you testified that utility ownership is needed for Dominion to fulfill its requirements as a system operator. Is that right?
That's correct.
Can you point me to anywhere in the South Carolina Code of Laws or to any regulation adopted by this commission that requires a utility to own generation in order to fulfill its requirements as a system operator?
No, that's not a requirement. That's just a reasonable way of operating the system.
But if it's not the only way to operate the system, if you could contract for that type of control and contract for that type of location you need, other parties could provide that.
Yes.
Is that correct? Okay. You talk lines 5 through 7 about citing solar in locations that address system-wide transmission issues. Is that right?
That's correct.
It says developer-selected renewable sites do not necessarily address those system-wide transmission issues. Is that your testimony?
Yes.
Are you aware that it is common practice in the utility industry to provide locational guidance to bidders who are competing in a competitive procurement, and that geographic location can be considered in evaluating competitive bids?
I'm not aware of that.
Would it surprise you to know that that is possible and that's part of the industry practice?
It would not surprise me.
Even with PURPA projects, the General Assembly has provided for avoided cost methodologies that do account for geographic location of the QFs. Are you aware of that?
Yes, I am.
All right. Has Dominion ever proposed avoided cost methodologies that account for geographic location?
Not that I'm aware of.
But Dominion can retain full dispatch rights over a solar facility owned by an IPP, can't it?
If that was part of the contract,
Right. It's the contract is king in that type of relationship, correct?
yes.
All right. So if the IPP is incentivized to maximize production from those facilities because that's how they get paid, let's strike that. An IPP is incentivized to maximize production from its facilities because that's how it gets paid, by selling power to the utility. Is that right?
Yes.
All right. But a rate-based asset that is owned by a utility is not cost recovered based on production from the facility itself, is it?
No.
And so a facility that underperforms and is owned by an IPP, who bears the financial risk in that situation? The IPP or the utility?
Well, we're talking generically, but generically the IPP.
Okay. But a utility asset that underperforms, that risk is borne by the ratepayers, isn't it?
Well, the recovery mechanisms are different, and that's what you're referring to, I think. But if the utility had control of the unit, it may be more cost effective to actually produce less from a utility-owned solar facility rather than take the full output from an IPP solar facility.
When you're looking at a 50-50 split as you proposed, that doesn't emerge. This 50-50 split did not emerge from modeling as a least cost result. It was actually forced into the Plexos modeling from the beginning.
That's right.
Okay. So it's very possible that if you were modeling ownership of solar and done so in a cost competitive environment, it might actually do far more IPP than a 50-50 split out of that 5,000 megawatts of solar you've ultimately proposed. Is that right?
That could be an outcome of the model.
Okay. Thank you. Let me check my notes real quick, and that may be all I've got. No further questions at this time. Thank you for your time, Mr. Neely.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Burns. Office of Regulatory Staff.
No cross for ORS. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Huber. This might be a good stopping point for lunch. Let's come back at 2 p.m. and we will resume with commissioner questions for this panel. Gentlemen, you know the rule, no discussing your testimony with anyone or letting anyone discuss your testimony in your presence. You can talk about the upcoming football games, the weather, anything else. Just don't talk about the case if you don't mind. Thank you. We'll see you at 2 p.m.